Beneath the vast stillness of the Arabian desert, where the horizon stretches like an ancient whisper across a world sculpted by heat and silence, there exists a deeper story that most of humanity has forgotten. Before the dunes rolled over the land like a slow and patient tide, before the winds shaped mountains of sand that swallowed whole valleys, these regions carried the pulse of civilizations that rose long before our earliest written memories. It is difficult to imagine such a truth when one stands beneath the blazing sun, surrounded by landscapes that seem lifeless, but the desert has a habit of hiding what it refuses to erase. And as we begin to study these spaces with the eyes of modern technology, a quiet but profound realization emerges. The emptiest places on our maps may hold the densest concentrations of lost human history. Yet the deeper question arises: how much of ourselves has vanished under forces we never learned to understand? The sand itself is a paradox, soft enough to crumble beneath your fingers, yet powerful enough to erase entire worlds. It builds nothing, yet buries everything, turning thriving cities into ghostly silhouettes preserved under its weight. For thousands of years, deserts were seen as barriers, hostile regions where life retreats and memory dissolves. Ancient travelers described them as the domains of forgotten gods, haunted by the remains of civilizations that dared to challenge the shifting earth. But what if their myths contained a truth hidden inside metaphor? What if the landscapes we now see as symbols of emptiness were once fertile, green, thriving spaces where rivers flowed, markets crowded, voices echoed, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next? Here the mystery deepens, for the sand is not merely a blanket. It is a chronicle written in layers. Recent discoveries begin to shift our interpretation of these expanses. Satellite images, scanning from orbits high above the planet, reveal perfectly straight lines etched beneath dunes that should have been featureless. Rectangular shapes appear where no natural formation could exist. Subtle geometric signatures, too precise for nature, too ancient for our modern expectations, indicate city walls, road networks, irrigation systems, even the outlines of large complexes whose purposes remain unknown. AI-powered systems, trained to detect patterns invisible to the human eye, amplify these signatures, reconstructing digital ghosts of civilizations that predate the very idea of recorded history. And so the desert begins to speak, not through relics we hold in our hands, but through mathematical shadows buried beneath centuries of silence. But why were these civilizations forgotten? Here a troubling possibility arises. The climatic shifts that sculpted these deserts were not sudden, but slow and merciless. Over millennia, rainfall patterns changed. Rivers dried. Grasslands turned to dust. Cities that depended on fertile plains watched their foundations crack as drought deepened. A marketplace abandoned in one generation became unrecognizable in the next. And as the sand advanced like a creeping tide, the final traces of these societies vanished. Not destroyed abruptly like the cities lost to volcanic eruptions or floods, but erased gently, silently, thoroughly. These cultures did not vanish in an instant. They faded into disappearance so slowly that no one alive realized an entire world was being swallowed. This raises a profound question. If the desert can erase a civilization so thoroughly that even its name vanishes from memory, how many cycles of human advancement and collapse might have occurred before the version of history we now call our own? Archaeology gives us fragments of answers, often framed by what the Earth is willing to return. But the desert behaves differently from the forests of the Amazon or the river valleys of East Asia. Where vegetation consumes ruins or floods bury settlements, the desert preserves. It locks artifacts in place, shielding them from moisture, bacteria, and time. In a strange and almost poetic way, abandonment becomes protection. The very force that destroys a civilization becomes the reason its traces survive long enough to be rediscovered. Yet the truth may be stranger still. The desert did not simply bury these cities. It hid them as if waiting for a future intelligence to find them. Ancient Mesopotamian records describe entire regions swallowed by sandstorms that lasted months, darkening the sky and leaving cities uninhabitable. Some texts speak of temples buried so deeply that only their rooftops could be seen by those passing through the wasteland. Others mention roads that vanished overnight under winds carrying sand from thousands of miles away. If such events occurred regularly, civilizations may have been forced into cycles of migration, adaptation, collapse, and rebirth. Perhaps the earliest stories of lost kingdoms were not myths, but memories of real catastrophes. And this is where the narrative begins to bend. If such collapses happened repeatedly across continents, what patterns might we uncover when we look beneath every desert on Earth? The Sahara, now the world's largest continuous sand desert, was once a mosaic of lakes, forests, and fertile grasslands teeming with wildlife. Human settlements dotted its edges, and ancient art carved into stone depicts scenes of swimming, hunting, and farming. These images challenge our assumptions about what deserts used to be. Satellite studies now show the ghost networks of rivers, some stretching hundreds of kilometers, hidden beneath dunes. These were not minor streams, but vast channels capable of supporting large populations. Some appear to flow directly toward regions where radar detects rectangular clusters, suggestive of streets or administrative complexes. Here another question emerges. Were these early cities connected in ways we never imagined? Could there have been trade routes long before camel caravans crossed the dunes? AI radar scanning pushes the mystery even further. Using signals that penetrate meters below the surface, modern systems construct three-dimensional reconstructions with astonishing accuracy. Structures with perfectly right angles, spaced at regular intervals, begin to appear in digital form. Some resemble residential grids. Others appear monumental, with foundations larger than any known temple in the surrounding regions. One site detected in the Arabian desert shows a cluster of buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with a secondary ring of walls surrounding the entire complex. The pattern is unmistakably deliberate, yet no archaeological team has touched it. It remains entirely beneath the sand, unseen by human eyes for millennia. And so a haunting thought settles in. How many entire histories lie buried simply because we have not yet developed the tools to sense them? Climate change complicates the picture even further. While prolonged droughts reveal some buried structures by stripping away layers of protective soil, increasing temperatures and intensifying winds rebury excavated sites faster than archaeologists can study them. In parts of Mesopotamia, entire temples exposed in the 20th century are now nearly invisible again, swallowed by storms that move with the strength of shifting climates. The Mother of Scorpions, temple complex, once partially unearthed and studied, is fading into obscurity as dunes advance over it with renewed speed. Archaeologists, overwhelmed, can no longer keep pace with the encroaching sand. The desert taketh away faster than humans can record. This creates an unsettling paradox. We are living at a moment when technology finally allows us to detect ancient civilizations that were invisible for thousands of years, yet the forces of nature are working simultaneously to bury them once more. We stand in a narrow window of opportunity where the ancient past is both revealing itself and disappearing simultaneously. If humanity fails to act now, we may lose these sites forever, not because we lack curiosity, but because the planet itself is changing faster than our ability to decode its memory. And yet, another possibility arises, one more radical than climate or erosion. What if ancient civilizations understood this cycle? What if they built their cities with the expectation that sand would one day reclaim the land? Some structures uncovered near ancient trade hubs show signs of intentional elevation, protective walls, and layered foundations designed to resist drifting dunes. Such engineering hints at a knowledge of desert motion far more sophisticated than previously believed. If these builders foresaw their own burial, perhaps they also intended for later civilizations to find their works using methods they could not predict. Perhaps they saw sand not merely as destruction, but as preservation. Here the story takes a philosophical turn. When we imagine lost civilizations, we picture their ruins as tragic reminders of failure. But what if their disappearance was part of a larger rhythm, one that cycles through rise, flourish, burial, and rediscovery? Humanity measures progress in linear terms, believing that history moves in one direction, step by step, toward greater knowledge. But the desert invites us to consider a different model, that history is cyclical, layered, recursive. A city may vanish, but its memory sleeps. Thousands of years later, humans awaken it, reconstruct it, give it life again. In this sense, the desert becomes a cosmic archive, not an eraser. So how many times have we risen and vanished? Excavations across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Near East reveal repeated patterns. Civilizations emerge where rivers flow, they expand during times of abundant rainfall, and they collapse when drought tightens its grip. The layers of occupation at many ancient sites show this cycle occurring multiple times. Entire cities built atop older cities, which were themselves built upon even older settlements. This vertical layering indicates not a singular rise and fall, but an ongoing conversation between humans and landscape, a negotiation with climate, time, and fate. Perhaps the most haunting realization is this: we are not discovering the first great civilizations of humanity. We are discovering the latest ones buried by the most recent cycle. This reframes our understanding of human antiquity. If deserts once bloomed with life repeatedly, then the civilizations we now admire, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, may have been inheritors of legacies that extended far beyond their written histories. Their myths of lost golden ages, forgotten kingdoms, and vanished worlds may have been fragmented memories of real epics swallowed by sand long before their time. And this is where the story deepens further. If we are witnessing only the surface of humanity's forgotten history beneath the dunes, how much older might our species' relationship with civilization truly be? DNA evidence suggests that Homo sapiens have existed for at least 300,000 years. Yet the earliest known cities date back only about 9,000 years. This gap is enormous, stretching across a vast expanse of time where humans possessed the intelligence to build complex societies but left behind almost no trace. What filled that silence? Could entire civilizations have risen and vanished during those hundreds of thousands of years, erased by shifting Earth, climate changes, and the relentless advance of deserts? Some researchers propose that the archaeological record is biased heavily toward the last few millennia simply because older sites lie in regions where erosion, tectonic activity, or desertification have hidden them completely. Radar scans of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula cover only a fraction of the land. What might we find if we scan the entire desert floor with high-resolution AI systems capable of detecting structures the size of a single room? Would we find dozens of lost cities? Hundreds? Thousands? Or perhaps we would find evidence of civilizations whose architectural styles, technologies, and worldviews differ radically from anything known today. In this possibility lies a quiet thrill, for the Earth may be far older, far more layered, and far more complex in its human history than any textbook suggests. But with excitement comes fear. For every site revealed by drought, another is buried by storms. Archaeologists working in the Middle East often arrive at locations they documented only a decade earlier, only to find them buried again as if the desert were reclaiming its secrets. This creates an emotional tension. We are racing against time not to discover history, but to preserve its final fragile traces before they vanish. Humanity, in this moment, becomes both explorer and archivist, trying to protect what the Earth reveals while knowing that natural forces remain indifferent to our efforts. The deserts, once seen as dead zones, emerge instead as monuments to impermanence. They remind us that civilizations, no matter how advanced or enduring they appear, remain at the mercy of climate and geography. They remind us that the Earth does not guarantee memory, it demands it. And so the presence of lost cities beneath these dunes becomes a mirror reflecting our own fragility. If entire worlds could vanish beneath the sand, so can ours. Yet there is hope inside this reflection. For the fact that we are rediscovering these places now means that humanity has reached a technological moment where the invisible becomes visible, where the buried becomes readable, where the forgotten becomes known. Perhaps this is not an accident, but part of the cycle itself. Civilization rises, falls, sleeps beneath the earth, and later humans with new tools awaken their ancestors' echoes. In this awakening we find continuity, connection, and humility. The story of deserts is ultimately the story of time. They do not move quickly, yet they reshape continents. They do not destroy violently, yet they erase thoroughly. They do not speak loudly, yet they preserve the whispers of forgotten civilizations. And as we continue to uncover these whispers with satellites, radar, and AI, we realize we are no longer merely studying history. We are entering a dialogue with it. The Earth shows us fragments, we interpret them, and together a story forms. A story that suggests humanity may be older, more resilient, and more cyclical than we ever imagined. And so the final question stands like a solitary dune against the horizon. How many times have we risen, built, flourished, and vanished beneath the shifting Earth? The desert knows. And for the first time in human history, we are beginning to hear its answer. When people imagine a drowning, they picture water rising fast, consuming everything with a sudden and merciless force. But the drowning that reshaped the ancient world happened in reverse, unfolding not in minutes, but millennia, not through waves, but through silence. It began with the slow retreat of clouds, the quiet dying of lakes, and the gradual weakening of rains that had nourished entire cultures. Deserts do not announce their arrival with a roar. They appear grain by grain, as if time itself were gently undoing the memory of what once lived. And so, between 9,000 and 3,500 years before our present age, a long, invisible flood swept across North Africa and Arabia, consuming the green world that had flourished there. What vanished beneath this flood were not small camps or temporary shelters, but communities that had thrived for generations, settlements that cultivated crops, herded livestock, constructed stone alignments, and carved myths into the bedrock long before any known empire rose along the Nile or between the rivers of Mesopotamia. Their disappearance is not the story of a single moment, but a long unwinding in which people slowly realized their world was becoming uninhabitable. The tragedy was not sudden enough to be documented, yet not slow enough to be ignored. And here a haunting question emerges. How does a civilization understand its own ending when the end arrives as a slow whisper rather than a catastrophic scream? The Sahara's transformation is perhaps the most dramatic example of a climate shift witnessed by human societies. 6,000 years ago, the vast desert was a savanna. Rainfall patterns fueled lakes the size of modern nations. Herds of cattle grazed in open grasslands. Hunters followed antelope through green plains. People settled near freshwater basins, crafting pottery, constructing megalithic spaces, and charting the movements of stars across the sky. We know this not from imagination, but from remnants uncovered in dry lake beds, fish bones, harpoons made from bone and horn, and rock art depicting boats gliding through waters that no longer exist. These fragments tell of a world that contradicts everything we assume about North Africa. But climate is the great storyteller of Earth, and it rarely repeats itself. As rainfall dwindled, lakes shrank year by year. Rivers that once fed entire ecosystems cracked into dust. The land dried so thoroughly that settlements were left stranded in what quickly became desolation. People who had built communities across a green Sahara began migrating toward regions where water still flowed. Some moved eastward toward the Nile, joining others already living there. It is here that an astonishing possibility emerges. The ancestors who contributed to the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization may have come from societies already shaped by the trauma of a disappearing world. Their knowledge of cattle, stone construction, astronomy, and seasonal cycles may have carried memories of a time when the Sahara was alive. Yet of all the ancient sites swallowed by this slow drowning, Nabta Playa stands as one of the most enigmatic. Located in what is now Egypt's western desert, this prehistoric ceremonial center was far more than a gathering place. It housed stone circles aligned with celestial events, marking solstices and star risings with architectural precision far older than Stonehenge. The people who built it possessed an understanding of time rooted not only in their environment, but in the heavens. They lived in harmony with cycles of rain and drought, adjusting their movements as the landscape changed. But even their insight could not save them from the long retreat of moisture. Among the most mysterious artifacts of Nabta Playa is a sculpted boulder weighing 2 to 3 tons, deliberately shaped into the form of a cow. This figure, buried beneath megaliths, suggests a deep symbolic reverence for cattle, perhaps linked to creation myths in which life emerges from earth and water. The sculpture raises a question that feels almost mythic. Did these people carve their stories in stone because they sensed that their world was dying? If so, the cow-shaped monument becomes not merely a relic but a lament for a landscape in decline. And yet, buried beneath the sand, it was preserved for thousands of years, its meaning waiting for a future intelligence to revive it. Leaving Nabta Playa behind, one travels deep into the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. Spanning over 250,000 square miles, this vast expanse of unbroken sand is one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. To the untrained eye, it appears eternal and untouched, a place where nothing could ever have lived. But radar tells another story. Using penetrating signals, scientists have detected the faint outlines of settlements buried beneath the dunes, roads, foundations, and clusters of structures that once marked important stops along ancient trade routes. For centuries, these routes carried frankincense and myrrh, substances so valuable they shaped economies across continents. Yet the people behind these settlements remain largely unknown. No written records chronicle their daily lives. No preserved inscriptions speak their names. Their histories were erased by a force no army could have stopped, the slow drowning of sand and wind. And this is where the story bends toward the legendary city of Ubar, long spoken of in ancient lore as the Atlantis of the sands. Its existence was dismissed for generations as myth until satellite imagery revealed something astonishing: converging paths, ancient camel tracks hidden beneath dunes, leading to a massive limestone sinkhole. This convergence indicated a central hub where caravans once gathered. Excavations confirmed the presence of a fortified settlement with walls and towers. But Ubar's demise was not due to a sudden storm or invasion. Instead, the limestone table beneath the city collapsed, likely during an earthquake between the 3rd and 5th centuries. The sinkhole swallowed the settlement gradually, layer by layer. But long before this geological event sealed its fate, the real death blow had occurred: the collapse of the incense trade itself. As new trade routes emerged and demand decreased, Ubar's economic lifeline withered. The city was effectively abandoned, left vulnerable to the shifting desert that eventually buried it from memory. Here another unsettling question arises. How many cities vanished not because they were destroyed violently, but simply because the world no longer needed them? Economic decline, climate shifts, and the silent march of sand can erase history as effectively as war. When trade dies, so do the roads. When rivers vanish, so do the people. And when the last traveler forgets a route, the desert reclaims it completely. The slow drowning of ancient civilizations teaches a humbling truth about time. Change operates on scales that human memory cannot sustain. A society may flourish for 1,000 years, yet in only a few generations its descendants may forget the landscapes their ancestors mastered. Oral traditions may preserve fragments, stories of lost lakes, vanished herds, or abandoned stone temples. But these whispers fade as each generation reinterprets them. Eventually, myth replaces memory, and legend replaces fact. What was once a real city becomes a tale told around fires. What was once a living culture becomes a ghost hidden beneath dunes no one thinks to search. But in this forgetting lies a paradox. While desertification buries ancient sites, it also preserves them. The same sand that suffocates a settlement shields it from moisture, decay, and erosion. It becomes a natural time capsule, sealing history in place until technology becomes advanced enough to uncover it. Without the desert, the megaliths of Nabta Playa might have eroded to dust. Without the sand, the outlines of ancient trade cities might have been scattered beyond recognition. What destroys also protects, and this duality shapes the fate of civilizations across time. Yet the emotional weight of this paradox is difficult to ignore. Imagine being among the last generation of a dying landscape, watching each year bring less rainfall, each season take more from the soil. Imagine knowing that your children can no longer remain where your ancestors once thrived. Imagine leaving behind stone markers, ceremonial alignments, and monumental sculptures in the hope that someone, someday, might understand the significance of your vanished world. Humanity tends to see ancient peoples as unaware of their fate, but perhaps they recognized their world was ending. Perhaps they built monuments not only to honor their gods, but to communicate with the future. This slow drowning is still happening today. Modern climate patterns are revealing some ancient structures through drought, while burying others even deeper. Archaeologists in regions of the Middle East report that sites documented only decades earlier have vanished beneath new dunes, accelerated by shifting winds. This reality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The forces that shaped the ancient world continue to shape ours. Climate change is not a new phenomenon, but part of Earth's natural rhythm, a rhythm that civilizations ignore at their peril. And so the drowning in reverse continues, both a metaphor and a warning. For as we uncover stories of people who watch their lands die slowly, we are compelled to ask whether our own world might one day face a similar quiet unraveling. Civilizations rarely fall in fire and thunder. More often they fade, drifting into obscurity one season at a time, until the memory of what they once were becomes uncertain. In this sense, the ancient drowned landscapes of the Sahara and Arabia are not distant histories. They are mirrors reflecting our own vulnerabilities. The more we uncover about these ancient landscapes, the more we realize that the story of desertification is not simply a matter of drying lakes or shifting ecosystems. It is a profound rewriting of human geography. Entire cultural networks that once flourished across regions now considered uninhabitable likely shared traditions, technologies, belief systems, and trade routes that bound them into cohesive worlds. These connections dissolved not because of war or collapse, but because the routes themselves vanished beneath rising dunes. When movement becomes impossible, culture fragments. And when the ground beneath your feet becomes unpredictable, the world becomes smaller one horizon at a time. What disappeared, then, was not only land, it was memory. And this kind of forgetting is subtle. A generation moves away because the rains have weakened. Their children grow up in new regions, carrying only fragments of their ancestral world. 1,000 years later, those fragments become myths. 5,000 years later, even the myths vanish. And by the time modern humans began writing history, the story of the Green Sahara had already been buried beneath tens of thousands of dunes. This raises a sobering possibility. Perhaps the memory of desertification has shaped humanity more deeply than we can comprehend, influencing migration patterns, cultural evolution, and even the stories civilizations tell about beginnings and endings. In many ancient traditions, the idea of a world once filled with water, vegetation, or vast fertile plains appears as a recurring motif. Some early African and Middle Eastern mythologies speak of lands that dried up, of rivers that disappeared under divine or natural forces. These myths are often interpreted metaphorically, yet they may be faint echoes of real environmental catastrophes passed down through generations. Here a deep question emerges. How much of human spirituality, storytelling, and cosmology might have its roots in memories of landscapes transforming beyond recognition? Could the reverence for water in early civilizations have been shaped not only by its necessity, but by the trauma of losing entire worlds to thirst? But understanding the drowning in reverse requires examining not only the ecological shifts, but the human response to them. When people fled drying regions, they carried with them not just survival techniques, but cultural practices refined over millennia. The migration eastward toward the Nile, for example, may have seeded the foundations of ancient Egyptian civilization. The skills of desert pastoralists, astronomy, stone working, cattle herding, seasonal migration, may have merged with earlier Nile communities, accelerating the complexity of their culture. In this sense, the death of one landscape may have given birth to another civilization. Every burial of a world can become the soil of a new beginning. Yet, even in their movement, these ancient peoples likely understood that they were leaving behind more than homes. They were abandoning sacred spaces, ceremonial structures, and sites where generations had carved meaning into stone. Some megalithic alignments were designed with astonishing precision, suggesting a cosmological worldview deeply tied to the movement of stars and seasons. When the climate shifted, The reliability of these sky-ground relationships may have been disrupted, altering rituals and spiritual practices. The desert's advance may have been interpreted not merely as environmental change, but as a cosmic sign, a reconfiguration of the bond between Earth and heavens. This idea gains weight when we consider the deliberate burial of symbolic structures, such as the cow-shaped sculpture at Nabta Playa. This was not left exposed to erosion or theft. It was intentionally covered, perhaps indicating a ritual of preservation or farewell. Such acts suggest a consciousness of loss, a recognition that the world they knew was ending. In burying their sacred symbols, they may have been attempting to carry their identities into the future, trusting that someone would one day uncover them and understand. But time rarely keeps the intentions of ancestors intact. Thousands of years later, when these objects emerge from the sand, we interpret them through the lens of our knowledge, not theirs. In the Rub al-Khali, the burial of ancient settlements reveals another truth about the drowning in reverse. Not all losses occur uniformly. Some cities were abandoned early when water disappeared. Others survived for centuries, supported by deep wells or trade caravans. These surviving outposts became lifelines in an increasingly hostile world. They connected highland regions, coastal trade hubs, and inland oases. The caravans that traversed these networks transported more than goods. They carried stories, technologies, and cultural ideas. Yet as the sand accumulated, the very tracks these caravans followed were slowly erased. By the time new civilizations emerged in Arabia and the Levant, the abandoned cities had already become invisible beneath dunes. One of the most striking examples of this gradual disappearance is the legendary city of Ubar. When NASA satellites detected converging camel tracks hidden beneath sand, it revealed not only a lost city but the remnants of an entire transportation network. These tracks represented centuries of movement, footsteps of traders, herders, pilgrims, and wanderers. The convergence at Ubar indicates that the city functioned as a critical junction in ancient trade, perhaps connecting Yemen, Oman, and the interior of Arabia. But its demise illustrates the fragility of cities dependent on trade. When new maritime routes opened and the value of incense declined, Ubar's importance waned. Its collapse into the limestone sinkhole was merely the final chapter in a decline that had begun much earlier. In this pattern we find a universal lesson. Civilizations are not only shaped by the landscapes they inhabit, but by the networks that connect them. When those networks weaken, cities lose their purpose. When deserts expand, trade routes contract. And when economic lifelines die, culture disperses. The drowning in reverse shows us that collapse does not always arrive with catastrophe. Sometimes it comes with silence, roads unused, wells drying, stones shifting under the weight of time. But the true emotional power of this story comes from understanding what it means for a land to die slowly. Imagine the people who stayed behind longest, refusing to abandon their ancestral homes even as conditions worsened. Imagine the final generations walking through drying riverbeds, waiting for rains that never returned. Their children might have been the first to migrate, carrying with them memories of storms that once arrived like clockwork. Their grandchildren, born in greener lands, would know those storms only through stories. And their distant descendants might dismiss those stories as myth. The forgetting becomes generational, not malicious or careless, but inevitable. Human memory is simply not built to preserve landscapes that vanish over centuries. Modern climate science helps us trace this environmental unraveling with remarkable clarity. Pollen analysis reveals species shifts from grasses to desert shrubs. Lake cores show transitions from freshwater organisms to desiccated sediments. These changes occurred not as abrupt events, but as long, steady declines. The climate timeline of the Sahara's transformation resembles a slow descending staircase, each step representing a century of worsening drought. By the time the desert reached its modern form, countless settlements had been swallowed. Many were small pastoral camps. Others were vibrant villages. A few may have been ceremonial centers or early urban experiments. All share the same fate. They drowned in silence. And yet, the desert is not only a graveyard, it is also a library. Beneath the sand, fragile objects remain intact: pottery shards, stone blades, beads carved from ostrich eggshells, cattle figurines, and traces of early farming. These artifacts show remarkable resilience. They reveal complex social structures, trade systems, and symbolic traditions. They challenge assumptions that humans of the early Holocene lived simple or primitive lives. Instead, they demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of environment, astronomy, and communal organization. The people who thrived in the Green Sahara were not merely adapting, they were innovating. This innovation becomes even more striking when we consider early hydraulic engineering in regions now barren. Rock engravings depict irrigation channels, water troughs, and pastoral scenes. These are not the images of nomadic wanderers, but of people with stable living patterns, managing resources with precision. When the climate shifted, their knowledge likely fueled the rise of downstream civilizations. Consider how the Nile, once a refuge for climate migrants, became one of the most fertile cradles of human complexity. The skills carried by desert refugees may have been instrumental in shaping its early developmental stages. This perspective reframes the drowning in reverse as not only a story of loss, but of continuity. Civilizations do not vanish entirely, they transform. They move. They merge. They leave behind seeds that take root elsewhere under new circumstances. Desertification is not simply destruction. It is a force that compresses history, concentrating cultural memory into survivors who carry it forward. In this way, the drowning in reverse did not end the story of ancient Sahara cultures. It wove them into the genetic and cultural fabric of the civilizations that followed. Still, the emotional resonance of this tale rests in the recognition that the desert remembers everything even when humans do not. Under the dunes, time stops. Objects remain in suspended preservation. Cities freeze in the moment of their abandonment. The silence of the sand becomes a kind of eternity, holding stories in stasis until the day they re-emerge. But for every site rediscovered, countless others lie waiting, unknown, unimagined, and possibly unreachable. Technology is evolving quickly, but the desert is vast beyond comprehension. This leads us to a chilling realization. The drowning in reverse may be one of the most common fates for ancient civilizations. Deserts cover 1/3 of Earth's land, and many of them were once green, fertile, and inhabited. If the Sahara hid thousands of settlements, what might the Gobi conceal? The Kalahari? The deserts of Arabia, Iran, or Australia? How many worlds drown not in water but in dust, waiting for future civilizations to discover them? And if our ancestors once watched their lands die slowly, what does that mean for us today, living in a world where climate is shifting once again? Are we witnessing the early stages of another long forgetting? Will our descendants, thousands of years from now, search beneath their own dunes for the cities we built? The drowning in reverse offers no comforting answers. It offers only a mirror reflecting the fragility of human permanence. For in the end, it is not the deserts that forget, it is us. There is a particular heaviness that settles over cities abandoned not by violence, but by the slow withdrawing of life itself. These are not places shattered by fire or conquest, not ruins bearing scars of swords and sieges, but settlements left intact in their architecture, frozen in the moment a people realized they could no longer remain. Their walls still stand. Their rooms still hold objects once touched by living hands. Their streets still show the faint curvature of footsteps. And yet everything about them is a testament to the final rainfall they witnessed, to the moment the sky no longer answered the prayers of those who built their world beneath it. Such cities preserve a deeper kind of silence, the silence of hope that lingered too long. In southern Iraq, this silence resurfaced unexpectedly as drought lowered the waters of the Mosul Reservoir and revealed the 3,400-year-old Mitanni city of Kimyon. It emerged from the receding shoreline like a memory returning too late. Its multi-story storage complexes, administrative buildings, fortification walls, and workshops illuminated briefly in modern sunlight. Ceramic vessels, untouched for millennia, contained over 100 cuneiform tablets buried just beneath the surface. These tablets, shaped by hands that lived through war, rebuilding, and eventual abandonment, lay waiting only centimeters below a world that had forgotten them. And here a strange paradox reveals itself. It took the disappearance of water, the very force that once sustained the ancient city, to reveal the traces of a civilization that survived until water turned against them. Kimyun was no ordinary settlement. It belonged to the Mitanni, a Bronze Age kingdom that influenced empires, forged alliances, and shaped regional politics. A powerful earthquake around 1350 BCE collapsed the upper walls of its buildings, filling its streets with rubble and dust. Yet its inhabitants returned, rebuilt, and persisted. They repaired doorways, reinforced storage halls, and continued shaping bronze in their workshops. Their resilience was not born of denial but of necessity. They had known adversity before. They assumed they would overcome it again. But no amount of rebuilding could stop the climate from shifting. When the rains weakened and the Tigris receded, survival slipped beyond their grasp. The city did not burn. It simply emptied. Its people did not flee in panic but dispersed gradually, carrying their stories elsewhere as the land that once sustained them ceased to provide. The tragedy lies not only in the disappearance of Kimyun but in the manner of its survival. Preserved beneath water, then exposed by drought, it mirrors the cycle it once endured. A city that fell to the absence of rain was revealed by the absence of rain millennia later. And this is where the story bends deeper. How many such cities line the banks of ancient rivers, hidden beneath reservoirs, swamps, sediments, and shifting wetlands? How many times has the climate rewritten the archaeological record, leaving behind silences that we misinterpret as emptiness? Yet Kimyun is only one chapter in a narrative far older, reaching back to the earliest experiments in human monumentality. Far to the northwest, in southeastern Turkey, rises the enigmatic hill of Göbekli Tepe, a site that predates pottery, agriculture, metallurgy, and cities by thousands of years. Built between 9500 and 900 BCE, it defies the sequence of civilization long taught in textbooks. According to the conventional model, humans became farmers first, built permanent settlements next, and only then created temples and monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe reverses this timeline completely. Here, massive stone enclosures with T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, were erected long before farming was widespread. Ritual gatherings seem to have existed before cities, perhaps even giving rise to them. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe form circular enclosures, each with 10 to 12 upright monoliths surrounding two central pillars that tower above the rest. Their surfaces bear exquisitely carved images: foxes, snakes, scorpions, boars, vultures, cranes, and stylized human forms whose meanings remain elusive. These carvings were not mere decoration. They were expressions of belief, cosmology, and identity. Tens of thousands of animal bones litter the site, evidence of large feasts and ceremonies held at the dawn of the Neolithic. The sheer scale of consumption suggests that groups traveled great distances to gather here. They built not because they were settled, but because they chose to be connected. This realization rearranges the foundations of what we believe about human beginnings. If people were gathering to construct monumental architecture before agriculture existed, then perhaps belief systems, rituals, and shared myths were the true catalysts of civilization. Perhaps it was not food that brought people together, but meaning. And when meaning becomes the anchor of community, architecture follows, even in harsh or marginal environments. Göbekli Tepe sits on land that would later become difficult to sustain without agricultural innovation. Yet the builders committed enormous labor to shape this place into a sanctuary of stone. The deepest mystery of Göbekli Tepe, however, lies not only in its construction but in its deliberate burial. Sometime in the early 8th millennium BCE, the enclosures were intentionally filled with sediment, rubble, and refuse. The spaces that had once held ceremonies were entombed by the very people who created them. This burial was not the result of gradual abandonment. It was a deliberate act of closure, a ritual ending, a conscious decision to seal the site forever. Such an action raises unsettling questions. Were they preserving it for the future? Were they retiring the site as part of a cosmological cycle? Or were they responding to environmental changes they could not escape? In burying their sacred architecture, were they acknowledging that their world, whatever cosmic order they believed in, was shifting beyond recognition? If so, Göbekli Tepe becomes not only a beginning of civilization, but also one of the earliest recorded responses to environmental or cultural transformation. Its burial suggests that humans have long recognized the fragility of their worlds, long understood that permanence is an illusion. And when we stand on its hill today, looking at carved limestone pillars preserved beneath the artificial mound, we confront the possibility that the people who built these structures knew their way of life was fading long before they moved on. Yet Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated phenomenon. Across the deserts of Egypt's western regions, particularly in the Farafra Depression, lie traces of settlements dating to 700 to 800 BCE. These communities lived 12 miles apart, forming early networks of communication and exchange. Their organization implies collective planning, resource sharing, and coordinated movement, a miniature blueprint of later civilizations. They were not crude camps, but intentional communities shaped by environmental rhythms. As the climate shifted, these people, too, were driven toward the Nile, joining the broader migration that contributed to the early development of Egyptian society. Their settlements, now called hidden valley sites, were swallowed by the same long processes of aridification that consumed other ancient worlds. And yet, the poignancy of these early settlements lies in their intimacy. They were not grand cities or monumental temples, but small, interconnected communities where life was measured by the cycle of seasons. Their disappearance into the desert is a quiet reminder that civilization does not begin with greatness. It begins with networks, relationships, and shared environments. When the last rain fell over these lands, the people who lived there likely sensed the change. They watched their wells dry and their hunting grounds empty. They moved on, leaving behind stone hearths, simple tools, and the faint outline of a life that once had rhythm and continuity. When we gather these stories together, Kimyun, Göbekli Tepe, the Farafra settlements, we see a pattern emerging across millennia. Humans build, adapt, persist, and eventually step away when the environment becomes incompatible with the lives they have cultivated. Cities are abandoned not because their walls fail, but because the skies no longer provide. And this raises a profound question. Do civilizations truly collapse, or do they simply migrate, carrying their knowledge forward until new landscapes become home? The answer may lie not in the ruins themselves, but in the silence they hold. Cities that watch the last rain are not ruins of defeat. They are monuments to endurance. They reflect humanity's ability to move through cycles of environmental change, to reinvent itself repeatedly, and to leave behind traces of who we were. But they also serve as warnings. For if ancient peoples with far fewer tools could recognize the signs of changing climates, then what excuse do we have now, in an age capable of measuring the atmosphere with microscopic precision? What remains haunting is the chance that the builders of these ancient sites understood their fate more clearly than we understand ours. They knew their rains were slowing. They felt the land drying beneath their feet. They saw the patterns shifting. And perhaps, in their final gatherings, they spoke of a future world that would uncover their stones and wonder who they were. They did not imagine the specifics of our technologies, but they understood the cycles of time. They understood that nothing lasts forever, not even the sky's generosity. Their abandoned cities, therefore, become acts of communication across 10 millennia, and we stand now as the recipients of that message. Cities that watch the last rain do not disappear quietly. They leave behind subtle signatures, architectural pauses, unfinished repairs, tools left mid-task, storage rooms that were once carefully organized but abandoned in gradual disarray. These details are not evidence of chaos, but of a slow settling of resignation, the kind that builds over years rather than days. In many such places, archaeologists find nothing dramatic. No burned layers, no broken defenses, no signs of violent upheaval. Instead, they find everyday life frozen at the moment when staying became impossible. It is a kind of departure that speaks more loudly than any battlefield ruin. It is the moment when a people decide that continuity is no longer viable. In the case of Kimyun, the final years of occupation likely carried a profound emotional weight. Families living in multi-story storage buildings would have noticed the walls of their granaries growing emptier with each season. Bronze workers, once busy forging tools and ornaments, may have watched the availability of or diminish as trade networks contracted. Children would have grown up hearing stories of heavier rains, greener seasons, and more abundant harvests, stories that slowly took on the tone of myth rather than memory. When the final decision to leave came, it was probably not met with panic, but with sorrow. Their migration would have been orderly, contemplative, shaped by the understanding that they were stepping away from a landscape that had shaped their identity for generations. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. At Göbekli Tepe, the decision to bury the site suggests a worldview far more introspective than we often credit early humans with possessing. Instead of abandoning their sacred enclosures to erosion, they deliberately filled them, stone by stone, with remnants of feasts, broken tools, and sediments. This was not neglect. It was a ritual closure, an intentional ending to a chapter of their civilization. In this act, we see the earliest example of humanity acknowledging the passage of eras. The builders were not simply responding to environmental pressures, they were negotiating their place in a changing cosmos. Some archaeologists suggest the burial may have marked the end of a belief system, a ceremonial retirement of ideas that had guided them through centuries. Others think it might have been a form of protection, an attempt to preserve sacred knowledge for future generations. Both interpretations reveal an awareness of impermanence, a sensitivity to the fragility of their world. And if they understood the instability of climate and landscape, their decision to bury their sacred site becomes not only practical, but philosophical, a symbolic recognition that even monuments carved from stone cannot defy time indefinitely. The Farafra Depression offers a more intimate glimpse into abandonment. Here, settlements between 700 and 800 BCE were modest, a cluster of hearths, stone flakes, simple shelters, and water sources that sustained small communities. Their proximity to one another suggests interdependence, a shared understanding of seasonal migration and resource management. Yet their abandonment was not sudden. It occurred slowly, as rainfall decreased and water tables shifted. The people who lived there likely moved closer to more permanent water sources, eventually joining larger communities along the Nile. Their movement was not a collapse, but an adaptation, a quiet continuation of life shaped by necessity rather than disaster. Their settlements, left behind in the dunes, now tell the story of a world that once held promise and rhythm. When studying these abandoned sites, one realizes that climate change does not erase uniformly. It selects, preserves, distorts, and hides. Some structures remain standing, protected by sediment. Others collapse under the soft pressure of centuries. Some stories survive through artifacts stored in sealed rooms. Others vanish completely, leaving behind only faint traces detectable through satellite or radar. This uneven preservation creates gaps in our understanding. We see a fragment of a building, but not the city it belonged to. We find pottery, but not the cultural practices behind it. We uncover a ceremonial alignment, but cannot fully reconstruct the rituals performed there. The past becomes a mosaic of incomplete images, interpreted through fragments of meaning. This incompleteness becomes particularly evident at Göbekli Tepe. Tens of thousands of animal bones indicate feasting on an enormous scale, yet we do not know whether these gatherings were seasonal, ritualistic, or communal. We see the artwork carved into the stone pillars, foxes, birds, leopards, snakes, but cannot decipher the symbolic language they represent. The human-like figures, with arms folded or positioned along the edges of the pillars, hint at gods, ancestors, or supernatural protectors. But their identities remain locked in the silence of prehistory. The site stands as a monumental question mark, challenging every assumption about the origins of religion, social organization, and creative expression. One of the most intriguing possibilities is that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a pilgrimage center, a place where multiple groups gathered periodically. If so, then the site's burial might represent not a practical closure, but a symbolic farewell from a unified cultural identity that was dissolving as environmental challenges forced groups into different ecological strategies. As communities adopted farming, settled into new regions, or dispersed across emerging landscapes, their worldviews may have diverged. The burial of Göbekli Tepe could represent a collective understanding that their shared sacred center no longer reflected their changing way of life. The cuneiform tablets discovered at Kimyun add another layer of mystery. Their contents remain unknown, sealed within clay for over 3,000 years. They may contain administrative records, grain storage lists, labor rosters, or trade receipts. They may contain letters, political agreements, or royal decrees. They may even contain narratives or personal reflections from scribes who lived through the city's final years. The fact that these tablets were found just centimeters below the surface speaks to the delicate balance between preservation and erasure. For millennia, the reservoir's waters protected them. When drought exposed them, they were moments away from being lost forever to the elements. The fate of their contents mirrors the fragility of the civilization that produced them. But perhaps the most startling insight is that Kimyun's abandonment was not immediate after the earthquake. The people returned. They rebuilt. They persisted for decades, maybe centuries. This reveals a deep-rooted human trait, the refusal to accept the end until it can no longer be denied. Humans rarely abandon their worlds quickly. They try to reclaim stability even when the environment signals its departure. This perseverance, though admirable, often intersects tragically with climate change. By the time a community accepts that the land can no longer support them, they are already living in the shadows of departure. In this way, cities that watch the last rain become mirrors for humanity's relationship with climate. They show us that survival is not simply about thriving. It is about recognizing when thriving is no longer possible. They remind us that stability is an illusion shaped by temporary conditions. When those conditions shift, the foundations of civilization shift with them. This realization challenges a modern belief deeply embedded in contemporary culture, the belief in permanence. We build skyscrapers, dams, highways, and entire metropolises assuming they will endure indefinitely. Yet ancient cities thought to be eternal, Babylon, Akkad, Ugarit, Mohenjo-daro, were all abandoned when climate patterns changed, rivers shifted, or trade routes collapsed. Their stories remind us that no matter how advanced a civilization becomes, it remains dependent on the generosity of its environment. Göbekli Tepe's burial and Kimyun's reemergence point to another haunting truth. Cities can disappear even when their people survive. Abandonment does not necessarily kill culture. It merely relocates it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe continued their lives elsewhere, carrying with them the memory of carved pillars and rituals beneath the stars. The inhabitants of Kimyun migrated toward more fertile regions, contributing to the broader tapestry of Mesopotamian civilization. The people of the Farafra Depression moved toward the Nile, joining the communities that would later build monumental temples, develop writing, and chart the annual flooding of the river. Abandonment is not erasure, it is transformation. But for us, standing in the present, the ruins left behind become symbols of finality rather than continuity. We interpret them as endings, as moments when civilizations failed or disappeared. This interpretation blinds us to the cycles that shaped human history. Civilizations are not monolithic entities that rise once and fall once. They are dynamic, adaptive systems shaped by migration, climate, and changing needs. Cities vanish, but their knowledge persists. Landscapes collapse, but culture endures in new forms. The people who watched the last rain at Kimyun or Göbekli Tepe were not defeated. They were transformed. And yet, the emotional weight of these stories cannot be ignored. To build a monumental sanctuary and then bury it must have carried immense significance. To rebuild a city after an earthquake only to abandon it when the land failed must have been heartbreaking. To live in communities 12 miles apart and watch them empty one by one must have created a sense of loss that rippled across generations. These were not abstract processes. They were lived experiences filled with grief, resilience, and the quiet courage of people adapting to their changing world. When modern archaeologists uncover these places, they become temporary witnesses to the final moments of ancient lives. They stand where ancient hands once worked. They enter rooms where families once stored their grain. They hold tablets inscribed by scribes who never imagined their words would outlive their city. This intimacy turns archaeological discovery into a dialogue across time, a conversation between the living and the absent. As we uncover more sites lost to aridification, a profound question emerges. How many stories remain buried beneath deserts, waiting for the right combination of drought, technology, and chance to reveal them? And how many will vanish forever, erased by shifting sands before anyone ever knows they existed? The final lesson of cities that watch the last rain is not simply about the fragility of civilization. It is about the inevitability of change. These ancient people did not fail. They adapted, moved, and carried their identities forward. The landscape changed, but humanity endured. Yet the stones they left behind, the pillars, tablets, hearths, and walls, remain as silent witnesses to the truth that every civilization must eventually confront. The rain does not fall forever. Every civilization leaves behind its own language, but not all of them survive in ink, stone inscriptions, or carefully preserved chronicles. Some leave a different kind of vocabulary entirely, one shaped not by words, but by absences. Empty courtyards where shadows no longer gather. Silted canals that once carried water, but now hold only silence. Foundations without walls, walls without roofs, rooms without names. These remnants speak as clearly as any text, yet they require a different form of reading, a sensitivity to what is missing rather than what remains. In lands where climate change advances faster than excavation can keep pace, this language grows louder every year. Entire landscapes are becoming sentences erased mid-phrase, their meanings dissolving as the earth rearranges itself grain by grain. In Iraq's central desert lies al-Akrib, the mother of scorpions, a city whose name alone evokes a sense of danger and ancientness. For decades, archaeologists have worked to uncover its terracotta temple facades, administrative districts, ceremonial platforms, and residential quarters, painstakingly brushing away layers of sand to reveal a metropolis that flourished around 2350 BC. But what once took months of progress is now undone in days. Climate-driven sandstorms, intensified by regional warming and upstream dam projects that reduce river flow, sweep across the site with accelerating force. Dunes bury trenches, swallow artifacts, and collapse excavation walls. The sand arrives not as a blanket but as a tide, erasing decades of scholarship in a single season. What had been cleared now lies hidden again, and the rhythm of discovery is replaced by a rhythm of loss. The scale of burial is staggering. 5 square kilometers of ruins, temples, workshops, ceremonial halls, and storage complexes are once again disappearing beneath layers of fine sand carried from degraded agricultural lands. The advance is relentless. The desert, no longer held in place by moisture or vegetation, moves with a freedom it has not possessed in centuries. Archaeologists speak quietly of defeat, not because the site lacks importance, but because the forces erasing it are indifferent to their efforts. They document what they can, knowing much will be lost before they return the next season. The language of vanishing becomes a race against time, and time is winning. The tragedy of al-Akrib is mirrored by another kind of disappearance unfolding along the Persian Gulf. The ancient port city of Siraf, once a major trading hub that connected Mesopotamia, India, East Africa, and China, now faces erosion at a scale so rapid that scholars describe it as archaeologically devastating. Rising sea levels, combined with a decline in coastal sediment, have eaten away at nearly half of its shoreline. City walls, potters' districts, mosques, and bazaars that survived earthquakes, fires, and centuries of shifting empires are being consumed by a sea whose boundaries no longer behave as they once did. Here the disappearance does not come from sand, but from salt water. When waves crash against ancient stone, they do more than erode, they infiltrate. Salt crystals penetrate the mortar, expand within pores, and shatter walls from within. Structures built to withstand harsh desert sun crumble under the quiet pressure of chemical change. The sea reclaims what had once thrived along its edge, not out of malice, but because climate patterns have rewritten the equilibrium that once held land and water in balance. Across the Middle East and North Africa, this twin force of drowning and burial, rising seas and advancing deserts, forms a paradox that defies human expectations. Drought exposes ancient ruins along riverbanks and reservoirs, revealing cities like Kimyun and Bronze Age settlements long submerged beneath dam lakes. But that same drought forces modern farmers to pump saline groundwater, which in turn destroys mud brick structures whose chemistry cannot withstand salt. Ancient walls built 5,000 years ago crack, blister, and collapse as salt infiltrates their foundations. The very conditions that reveal history simultaneously erase it. This paradox becomes even sharper in Iran's Sistan region, where more than 1,000 modern villages have been abandoned due to intensifying sandstorms known as the 120-day winds. These storms once marked a seasonal cycle, predictable and survivable. Now, driven by regional warming, agricultural collapse, and the desiccation of Lake Hammon, they have grown into suffocating tempests that bury homes, obscure irrigation channels, and render farmland unusable. Villages that survived centuries now lie beneath dunes, joining the ancient ruins that disappeared before written history began. The continuity is disturbing. Modern people are being erased by the same forces that erased their ancestors. In conversations with archaeologists working in the region, a quiet urgency appears. They speak not in the dramatic tones of catastrophe, but with the calm desperation of people who know the scale of what is slipping away. They do not fear looters, conflicts, or political instability, threats that have long endangered archaeological sites. They fear the wind. They fear salt. They fear temperatures rising just a few degrees too high. They fear that the fragile equilibrium keeping ancient mud brick intact will vanish forever within their own lifetimes. Their warnings are not hypothetical. Climate projections suggest that the Middle East and North Africa may warm by 4 degrees Celsius in the next 3 decades. Such warming would transform millions of hectares of land into desert, accelerate sand dune mobility, and increase the frequency of extreme sandstorms. It would also intensify sea level rise, pulling coastlines inland and submerging archaeological layers that have not been touched for thousands of years. What we consider deserts today may become even more inhospitable. What we consider fertile regions may become dry plains, and what we consider stable coastlines may drown beneath encroaching tides. This future transforms archaeological fieldwork into an act of triage. Teams must decide which sites can be saved, which must be documented, and which will inevitably be lost. Excavation calendars shrink as seasons become hotter and storms more violent. In some places, work is restricted to a few months a year. In others, it becomes impossible altogether. The language of vanishing becomes a language of prioritization. Record what you can, while you can. Yet the story is not only one of destruction, it is also one of revelation. As drought lowers water tables and exposes long-buried surfaces, archaeologists glimpse new chapters of the ancient world. But each revelation carries a shadow. A newly exposed wall is also a newly vulnerable wall. A temple facade freed from sediment becomes a facade exposed to wind erosion. A cuneiform tablet discovered in a dry riverbed may crumble days later if not rescued. The earth brings the past to light only to remind us that its unveiling is temporary. This tension is embodied in Egypt's Nabta Playa, where 30 complex megalithic structures stand in a region increasingly under threat from sand coverage. These structures, stone alignments, menhirs, and ceremonial markers, date from 4600 to 3400 BCE. Some appear to align with bright stars, suggesting early astronomical observation on a scale far older than similar experiments elsewhere. But as the Sahara expands, dune systems shift unpredictably. What is visible today may be buried tomorrow, and what is buried may remain so indefinitely. Archaeologists working there describe the desert as breathing, exhaling structures into view and inhaling them back into concealment. In Sudan, the pyramids of El Kuru, Jebel Barkal, and Meroe, testaments to a Nubian civilization that rivaled Egypt, are at risk of disappearing beneath dunes. 200 pyramids stand in a line of vulnerability, where wind patterns enriched by regional warming push wave after wave of sand against their bases. These pyramids survived for over 2 millennia. They endured conquests, religious transformations, and natural weathering. Yet now, in a span as short as a single generation, they may be buried completely. The thought is chilling. Monuments built to defy mortality are being consumed by forces indifferent to the intentions of their builders. The irony deepens when one realizes that many of these structures were originally built in landscapes more stable than they are now. Ancient people chose their sites carefully, constructing temples, tombs, and cities in areas with predictable water sources or reliable climates. Their understanding of the environment was intimate and continuous. But environments change, sometimes on timescales too slow for a single generation to notice, yet too fast for civilizations to adapt. The language of vanishing is not written by sudden catastrophe. It is written by the accumulation of small, unremarkable shifts that eventually become irreversible. When archaeologists speak of losing sites entirely or completely, they are not exaggerating. They are describing a reality in which the Earth reclaims its surface at a pace far faster than human documentation can proceed. Memories encoded in mud brick, pottery, or stone carvings dissolve with each passing season. Trade routes mapped for thousands of years become untraceable. Urban layouts that once reflected sophisticated governance devolve into barely visible lines beneath shifting dunes. The past becomes abstracted, reduced to faint interpretations rather than tangible remains. This growing fragility forces us to confront uncomfortable parallels with our own time. Modern cities rely on infrastructure far more delicate than ancient clay walls or limestone pillars. Rising seas threaten megacities built along coastlines. Expanding deserts challenge agricultural regions that feed millions. Water scarcity pushes populations into conflict. If ancient civilizations, with smaller populations and simpler systems, could not withstand environmental shifts, what does that imply for us? Cities today may not be buried beneath sand, but they may drown beneath rising tides or collapse under the absence of fresh water. The language of vanishing is not confined to the ancient world. It whispers into our own future. The more we listen to this language of vanishing, the more we realize it is not silent at all. It only speaks in frequencies slower than human lifetimes. A dune shifting a centimeter in a day, a coastline retreating a meter in a year, a temperature rising a fraction of a degree each season. These changes operate outside the pace of our perception. Civilizations rise and fall in rhythms too slow to be felt, yet too powerful to resist. When we look back at the ancient world, it becomes clear that its disappearance was not a series of isolated tragedies, but a long, ongoing conversation between societies and the landscapes that sustained them. One of the clearest examples of this slow dialogue appears in the heart of Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once formed a cradle of agriculture so fertile that ancient writers believe paradise lay somewhere between their banks. Yet today, these rivers are shrinking at a rate unimaginable in the eras that depended on them. Dam projects in Turkey and Iran restrict the flow of water downstream, starving the rivers that nourished Mesopotamia for thousands of years. The Iraqi government estimates that water flow could fall by 60% in the coming years. Such a decline is not merely a political issue. It becomes an archaeological one when communities, forced to irrigate with saline groundwater, unknowingly destroy the mud-brick foundations of ancient cities. Salt is an invisible assassin. When used in irrigation, it seeps into the ground, rising through capillary action until it reaches the buried mud-brick walls that form the oldest architectural fabric of the region. Salts crystallize within the walls, expanding with each temperature fluctuation. Over the span of months, bricks crumble to powder, walls collapse inward, and the outlines of entire neighborhoods dissolve. Archaeologists who return to previously stable sites find walls that once stood for millennia reduced to brittle flakes. The story of Mesopotamian architecture, one of the world's earliest engineering traditions, is being erased not by neglect, but by the unintended consequences of survival. This reveals a tragedy rarely acknowledged. Modern people seeking to protect their own lives inadvertently accelerate the disappearance of ancient ones. A farmer who irrigates his land with salty water is not thinking of Sumerian foundations beneath his feet. A community trying to survive drought is not responsible for the fragility of temples built 5,000 years ago. Yet the result remains the same. the past collapses quietly under the pressure of the present. This intertwining of ancient and modern vulnerability becomes even more apparent as we look across the wider Middle East and North Africa. Climate models predict that by mid-century, large swaths of the region could become nearly uninhabitable for parts of the year due to extreme heat. Such heat accelerates evaporation, weakens soil cohesion, and increases the mobility of sand dunes. When the ground loses moisture, dunes begin behaving like waves, slow, relentless, and impossible to stop. Archaeological sites that remain partially preserved for millennia face rapid burial within a few decades. What once took centuries now takes years. In parts of Iran, this transformation is already underway. Over two-thirds of the country shows high or very high vulnerability to desertification. Ancient sites along the Silk Road, once lively rest stops for caravans connecting China to the Mediterranean, are gradually disappearing beneath advancing dunes. Some caravanserais, the fortified inns that once housed travelers and traders, are now visible only as faint ridges beneath sculpted sand. Their courtyards, places where merchants exchanged goods and stories, are filled, their walls now indistinguishable from the landscape. This quiet burial is not only a loss to history, it is a dismantling of human memory encoded in architecture. In the Nubian desert of Sudan, the risk becomes even more dramatic. 200 pyramids, slender, sharply angled structures associated with the kingdom of Kush, stand vulnerable to shifting sands. Built to honor royals and nobles, these pyramids once formed a sacred landscape that rivaled the grandeur of Egypt. But as sandstorms intensify, their lower courses vanish beneath accumulating dunes. Archaeologists working at Meroe describe the feeling of returning each season to find the desert has advanced several meters, swallowing steps, walls, even entire chambers. If current trends continue, these pyramids could be fully buried within a generation, a timescale shockingly brief compared to their ancient longevity. Yet burial is not the only threat these structures face. Temperature fluctuations, particularly extreme variations between scorching days and cold nights, place stress on stone, causing microfractures that widen over time. Wind-driven sand abrades surfaces, smoothing carved details and accelerating erosion. Salt blown from dried lake beds settles into joints, expanding and contracting with each shift in humidity. Each structure becomes a battleground between time and climate, with the latter gaining advantage at unprecedented speed. But the most haunting aspect of this vanishing is not the destruction. It is the pattern. Ancient sites reveal that this is not the first time the region has undergone dramatic environmental transformation. The Sahara's expansion, the desiccation of Arabia, the collapse of lakes and marshlands across the Fertile Crescent, all of these events reshaped human settlement long before written history. The difference today lies in the pace. What once took centuries or millennia now unfolds within decades. Archaeologists worry not only about the loss of ancient knowledge, but about the speed with which modern societies might follow the same path. For the villages of Iran's Sistan region, this is already a reality. Entire communities have fled their ancestral lands due to the 120-day winds, monstrous, sand-laden storms that scrape paint from buildings and strip bark from trees. These storms once marked a predictable season, part of the region's natural rhythm. Now they have intensified into something closer to a yearly catastrophe. Homes are filled with sand. Roads vanish under drifts. Crops fail. Schools close. Eventually, people leave. And when they do, they join a lineage stretching back 8,000 years, communities displaced by the climate they once adapted to. In all these cases, the language of vanishing is the same. Gestures of abandonment repeated across time. Doors left ajar. Hearths swept clean one last time. Wells carrying the last echo of a bucket. These small acts, preserved in ruins, signal the moment when a community accepts the inevitable. Yet they also reveal something profound. Leaving is not failure. It is an ancient survival strategy, a decision grounded in realism rather than despair. The people who abandoned al-Akhrib, Siraf, Farafra, Nabta Playa, or the Sistan villages were not defeated. They were responding to a planet in transition. But for archaeologists, the emotional weight of this vanishing is immense. They are not simply losing artifacts. They are losing questions, contexts, and potential revelations about the origins of human culture. Once a site disappears, whole chapters of history may be erased before they are even recognized as chapters. A collapsed wall might have contained inscriptions. A buried hearth might have held seeds capable of rewriting agricultural history. A silted canal might have revealed engineering techniques lost for millennia. The loss is not merely physical. It is intellectual, emotional, and existential. This is why excavation has become an act of urgency. In interviews, many archaeologists describe a sense of helplessness, as though they are scribes trying to copy the last pages of a book while the ink evaporates in front of them. They speak of documenting as quickly as possible, photographing walls moments before they crumble, retrieving pottery seconds before wind erases the trench edge. Some compare it to listening to a dying language spoken only by a handful of elders. Others describe it as watching history drown in sand. Yet even in the midst of loss, discovery persists. Climate change reveals as much as it erodes. Drought exposes cities hidden beneath reservoirs. Sandstorms unearth long-buried foundations. Melting permafrost in other regions releases artifacts frozen for thousands of years. It is as though the Earth is offering glimpses into forgotten eras even as it conceals them anew. In this strange exchange, we see a planet shifting through its own archives, revealing, erasing, rewriting. The language of vanishing, then, is not a vocabulary of silence, but of transformation. It teaches us that permanence is an illusion and that memory must be actively preserved rather than assumed. It forces us to confront the fragility of our own infrastructures, the vulnerability of our own cities, and the reality that what we build today may become tomorrow's buried chapter. In the end, the ruins of the ancient world speak not only of their own disappearance, but of ours. They remind us that civilizations are temporary arrangements between people and the landscapes that sustain them. When the landscape changes, the arrangement dissolves. And as the winds rise, as the deserts advance, as coastlines retreat, one truth emerges with painful clarity. We, too, are writing our own language of vanishing, whether we realize it or not. For most of human history, the desert was a blindfold. Its vastness overwhelmed the senses, its shifting dunes erased trails, and its silence made the land feel eternal and unchanging. Archaeologists could only work where their eyes could reach and their hands could dig, scratching at the surface of an ocean made of dust. They found cities only when storms revealed them or when a chance observation exposed a line of stone beneath shifting sands. For generations, the desert appeared to be the enemy of knowledge, too large, too fluid, too deceptive to yield its secrets willingly. Yet the irony is that the desert was never empty. It was full, overflowing with stories that simply lay beyond the limits of human vision. That blindness ended the moment machines began to see what humans could not. The arrival of satellite-borne synthetic aperture radar transformed the archaeology of deserts from guesswork into revelation. Unlike optical sensors, radar waves do not care about sand. They pass through it, bouncing off hidden structures, detecting shapes that sunlight cannot reach. A buried wall becomes a subtle shift in signal. A road becomes a faint line of reflection. The ghosts of ancient cities appear not as ruins, but as patterns, mathematical signatures left by civilizations erased from the surface, but preserved beneath it. This new way of seeing the Earth did more than confirm what archaeologists suspected. It overturned assumptions about the distribution of humanity itself. Where scholars had seen empty wastelands, radar revealed networks, settlements spaced at regular intervals, canals following geometric paths, field boundaries extending across regions believed uninhabitable for millennia. Roads ran straight as arrows beneath dunes that had moved for thousands of years. The desert was not a void, it was a palimpsest, a layered archive compressed by time. One of the most astonishing breakthroughs occurred in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, a place so vast and so forbidding that even modern explorers speak of it with reverence. Yet when researchers from Khalifa University aimed SAR technology at its interior, the desert responded like a negative of an ancient photograph developing in slow motion. Beneath dunes towering like frozen waves lay a 5,000-year-old urban landscape. Structures traced with precision within half a meter, their dimensions reconstructed by AI, their shadows rendered into three-dimensional models. Buildings absent from the world for 5 millennia reappeared as if waking from a long sleep. The site of Sarik al-Hadid became the centerpiece of this revelation. Once nothing more than a name in regional folklore, it emerged in radar images as an organized complex of structures, workshops, and ceremonial platforms. The SARAI combination mapped it without a single shovel touching sand. Researchers could rotate virtual buildings, measure walls, analyze layout patterns, even infer the functions of specific rooms. What once required months of excavation could now be achieved in hours from orbit. This was not merely efficiency, it was resurrection at scale. The technology developed for military reconnaissance and planetary exploration had inadvertently given archaeologists a time machine. It could scan thousands of square kilometers simultaneously, revealing in one sweep what would take lifetimes to uncover by hand. And with each scan, the pattern became clearer. Deserts were not the margins of human civilization. They were some of its densest regions, simply buried beyond sight. The revelation echoed work done decades earlier, when NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory provided satellite images to documentary filmmaker Nicholas Clapp. In those images, faint lines crossed the Omani Desert, ancient camel tracks invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in the radar's grainy contrast. These tracks converged on a point Clapp recognized from Arabian legends, the supposed location of Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands. Excavation would later reveal an octagonal fortress and a massive sinkhole that together formed one of archaeology's most dramatic rediscoveries. But the real lesson was the method. Radar had found the unfindable. The desert had been read like a manuscript. Since then, satellite archaeology has evolved into something approaching an omniscient view of ancient landscapes. Machine learning systems trained on known archaeological signatures can now identify patterns across millions of pixels, spotting rectangular anomalies, circular enclosures, linear depressions, and geometric arrangements that no human observer could detect. The AI does not tire. It does not miss faint outlines. It does not get overwhelmed by the scale of the desert. It simply reads. The result is unsettling. For every site archaeologists have excavated, there may be thousands more beneath the sand. Entire cities, forgotten irrigation networks, ceremonial complexes, and trade outposts mapped only as digital ghosts. The scale of undiscovered urbanism challenges everything we know about ancient population density. We used to imagine early civilizations as small islands in a sea of emptiness. Now it appears that the emptiness itself was an illusion, and the desert was a sea filled with life. This shift in perspective forces us to reconsider the narratives we have inherited. Ancient people did not scatter in isolation across harsh landscapes. They were connected, adapting to shifting climates, moving along routes that persisted for generations. The desert was not a barrier, it was a corridor. Yet even as technology reveals these hidden worlds, a tension emerges. We can see more than we can save. The deeper the machines peer beneath the dunes, the more obvious it becomes that the desert's silence was never emptiness, it was concealment. Across the Middle East and North Africa, SAR and machine learning reveal the faint geometries of vanished societies, patterns that speak of intention, coordination, and shared knowledge. Straight lines that were once roads stretch for kilometers before vanishing beneath dune crests. Rectangular outlines mark homes, workshops, storage rooms, and sanctuaries. Circular depressions hint at wells and cisterns that sustained caravans long before recorded history. Each pattern is a whisper from a world erased not by catastrophe, but by time and sand. Yet the breakthroughs extend far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. In Iran's Dasht-e-Lut, one of the hottest places on Earth, remote sensing has identified 87 ancient sites ranging from the 5th millennium BCE to the Islamic era. Many are now buried beneath shifting dunes, their architecture known only through spectral data. The irony is sharp. In a landscape where the ground becomes molten with heat, and where human habitation seems impossible, the machines reveal traces of communities that endured for thousands of years. These were not temporary camps, but structured settlements, complete with field systems, water management techniques, and trade networks. Their presence reframes the desert from a hostile void into a frontier of resilience. The shift in our understanding becomes even more dramatic when we consider how early archaeologists struggled with the limitations of their tools. For centuries, excavation depended on the unpredictable generosity of erosion, construction projects, or pure luck. Storms might expose a ruined wall. Farmers might uncover a fragment of pottery. Travelers might notice a curious line of stones. These chance encounters formed the backbone of discovery. How many cities remained unknown simply because no one happened to walk across their buried foundations? How many routes vanished because the dunes shifted before anyone recorded their direction? Technology breaks this pattern entirely. Where human exploration was linear, slow, and labor-intensive, satellite-based discovery is instantaneous, global, and omnidirectional. A single radar sweep can scan an expanse the size of a nation. A machine learning model can analyze millions of data points in minutes, mapping anomalies that would take teams of researchers decades to catalog manually. With each year, the list of potential archaeological sites grows longer. Some scholars describe it as a flood of information, overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. For the first time in history, we can see the ancient world at scale. We can map entire river systems long dried up, trace forgotten irrigation channels, and reconstruct ancient agricultural patterns that reveal how populations adapted to shifting climates. Field boundaries emerge beneath dunes like the ghost grid of a vanished society. Roads appear in parallel lines stretching toward vanished oases. The desert floor becomes a text written in faint strokes, and radar becomes the lens that reveals its script. But seeing everything introduces a new dilemma. The number of sites now known far exceeds the capacity of archaeologists to study them. Excavation is slow. Restoration is slower. Preservation is fragile. Meanwhile, climate pressures accelerate. Rising temperatures destabilize sediments. Sandstorms bury newly exposed ruins. Salts infiltrate mud brick walls the instant they contact air. The more the Earth reveals, the faster the Earth destroys. Technology uncovers a world we may never fully understand. This creates a profound tension. Archaeological visibility has peaked at the very moment archaeological survivability has plummeted. The ethical questions multiply. What do we do with the knowledge of thousands of sites that can never be excavated? Is it enough to map them digitally, to preserve their outlines as data even if their physical forms are lost? Does a three-dimensional radar model carry the same meaning as touching the stones themselves? What happens when the last traces of a culture exist only in digital reconstructions? Some scholars argue that virtual preservation is the future of archaeology, that digital models will outlast the ruins themselves and provide a more complete archive than any physical excavation ever could. Others caution that such models strip away the tactile, material essence of ancient life. A radar sweep cannot replicate the textures of stone, the residues on pottery, or the wear patterns on tools. It cannot replace the layers of soil that reveal the stories of floods, fires, and rebuilding. Data is powerful, but data is not whole. Yet the machines keep searching. They do not pause for philosophical debates. They do not worry about what can or cannot be saved. They sweep across continents, collecting signatures of lost urbanism, revealing networks older and more complex than our historical narratives can accommodate. The desert, once a blank space on maps, now resembles a shattered mosaic, fragments of a world where people lived, traded, worshipped, migrated, adapted, and vanished. Perhaps the most shocking revelation is numerical. The density of ancient settlement beneath the sands suggests that what we know of early human civilization is only a tiny fragment of what existed. For every excavated city, there might be 1,000 lost ones. For every temple uncovered, there might be dozens still hidden. The ancient world was not sparse, it was crowded. Its populations were not isolated, they were interconnected. Its cultures were not primitive, they were adaptive, innovative, and deeply attuned to shifting environments. This newfound vision forces us to confront a possibility long avoided by traditional archaeology, that the true history of humanity is not written in the ruins we can see, but in the vast expanses we have not yet uncovered. The desert is not a void. It is an archive of compressed time, layered in silence and waiting for the instruments capable of reading it. And now, for the first time, those instruments exist. Yet even as we master these new forms of vision, a deeper truth begins to take shape, one that unsettles our understanding of both the past and the present. The more the desert reveals, the more it demands a reckoning with the scale of our ignorance. For centuries, archaeologists believed that the ancient world was composed of a few dominant centers, great cities like Uruk, Memphis, Babylon, and Thebes, surrounded by smaller villages scattered sparsely across the landscape. But as SAR and machine learning sweep across the dunes, a new pattern emerges. The ancient world may have been far more urbanized than anyone imagined. The gaps between known cities are filling with the faint signatures of forgotten settlements. What we once thought were isolated cradles of civilization now appear as dense clusters in a far more extensive network. This revelation rewrites human geography. It suggests that the earliest cities did not emerge suddenly as singular inventions, but gradually as nodes in a system already rich with experimentation, mobility, and innovation. People were not waiting for the invention of agriculture to gather in numbers. They gathered long before, compelled by ritual, trade, and shared cosmology. Agriculture refined those gatherings into permanence, but it did not invent the instinct itself. The desert now confirms what Göbekli Tepe hinted at. Civilization is not a linear progression. It is a mosaic of parallel experiments, many of which survived only beneath the sand. But as we uncover these hidden cities digitally, another realization dawns. The archaeological map of the ancient world is expanding faster than the physical world can support excavation. Every year, thousands of new anomalies appear, grid-like patterns, circular enclosures, clusters of rectilinear signatures, all of them potential cities, temples, workshops, or burial grounds. Archaeologists do not celebrate these discoveries with unrestrained joy. They speak of them with a kind of trembling awe, like librarians handed thousands of unread manuscripts while standing inside a burning library. Because even as the machines find more, the desert continues to take. Sites mapped one season may be buried the next. Structures revealed by drought may collapse under heat. Foundations exposed by radar may lie beyond any practical reach, because reaching them would require moving mountains of sand, an effort too costly for most institutions. The digital catalog grows, but the physical world shrinks. In conversations with archaeologists, a quiet philosophical shift is taking place. They no longer speak only of excavation, they speak of tree-off. They speak of conservation strategies for ruins they cannot physically touch. They speak of prioritizing sites based not on importance, but on survivability. Which walls will still exist in 10 years? Which will dissolve into dust? Which anomalies should be documented now before the desert wipes them clean? For the first time in its history, archaeology is being forced to choose what history will remain. This tension becomes painfully clear when we examine the sites already slipping beyond reach. In parts of the Sahara, dunes move nearly a meter each year. A site mapped in January may be invisible by December. In the empty quarter, where dunes tower over 50 meters high, radar can detect buried architecture but cannot prevent the sand from consuming it entirely. In the Dasht-e Lut, winds carve new landscapes every season, scouring away traces before archaeologists can act. The machines can see the past, but the machines cannot save it. And so a new discipline emerges, archaeology of the unseen. It is a science of patterns rather than artifacts, of models rather than ruins. Researchers analyze spectral signatures, geometric arrangements, and reflectivity patterns to infer the presence of structures they may never physically uncover. This data becomes its own archive, one that exists independent of the vulnerable Earth. But this raises a troubling question. If the only version of a lost city exists in digital form, does it truly exist at all? Or has it simply transitioned from physical history to informational memory? Some argue that this is not a loss, but an evolution. The same way ancient peoples carved their stories into stone, we now carve ours into data. The desert once erased human presence. Now technology preserves it in ways stone never could. But others fear that something irreplaceable is being severed, the material intimacy that connects us physically to the people of the past. A radar map cannot replicate the weight of a pottery shard held in the palm, the smell of ancient soil, the texture of carved limestone worn by hands long vanished. Yet in the midst of this debate, the desert offers its own quiet lesson. Sand is not the enemy of history. It is the custodian of it. It buries, but it also preserves. It erases, but it also seals. It conceals, but it also protects. The desert has kept millions of artifacts safe for thousands of years, far safer than humid climates or tropical forests ever could. What machines reveal today, the sand has safeguarded since the dawn of human settlement. This reframes the tension entirely. The desert is not destroying the past. Climate change is. Dunes once held in place by vegetation now drift freely because the land has dried. Coasts once buffered by sediment now erode because rivers no longer reach the sea. Sites once stable beneath a protective layer of sand are now destabilized by storms that strike with increasing intensity. The desert is not the villain. It is the stage on which a new crisis unfolds. And in that crisis, a deeper question arises. How much of human history remains undiscovered? And will we ever have time to uncover it? The question grows heavier with every radar sweep. If these are the cities we can detect now, how many lie beyond the limits of our tools? Each technological breakthrough expands the horizon of the possible while simultaneously enlarging the shadow of the unknown. The desert becomes an ocean of probabilities. Every anomaly raises hope for a new discovery, yet every passing season threatens to bury that hope deeper. Human history stretches beneath the dunes like constellations of forgotten lights, visible only when conditions align, vanishing the moment the wind decides otherwise. As SAR systems grow more sophisticated, they begin revealing not just isolated structures, but networks, routes stretching across hundreds of kilometers, linking settlements that scholars had assumed were culturally unconnected. These routes twist through wadis, edge along former riverbanks, and traverse regions believed uninhabitable. They chart the pathways of ancient caravans long before the domestication of the dromedary reshaped desert economies. They reveal how knowledge, goods, and beliefs flowed across landscapes modern geography books describe as empty. The more we recognize these patterns, the clearer it becomes that environmental hardship did not isolate people. It connected them through necessity and ingenuity. But visibility introduces responsibility. Archaeologists now face an ethical dilemma unique to our era. What do we do with a map of ruins that cannot be excavated? How do we honor the memory of a city we can detect but never touch? Can a place remain meaningful if its only surviving form is a digital pattern, a set of coordinates, a ghostly outline beneath the sand? Some propose that the future of archaeology lies in remote documentation, that a site mapped by radar, cataloged in a database, and preserved through high-resolution modeling carries intrinsic value even if it can never be physically uncovered. They argue that the essence of archaeology is understanding human behavior, not collecting artifacts. If technology can reveal the shape of vanished societies, then the absence of excavation need not be a defeat. It can be a shift in method. Others resist this idea, pointing out that the physical world contains layers of information no algorithm can detect. Soil chemistry, charred seeds, microstratigraphy, pigments, residues. These details cannot be extracted through satellite images. Without them, our interpretations remain skeletal. A radar signature may tell us where a wall once stood, but it cannot tell us who built it, what rituals they performed beside it, how they decorated its surface, or what they stored in the rooms it enclosed. Such losses matter. They shape the difference between data and story, between outline and truth. And yet the pace of climate change leaves little room for debate. In many regions, the window for excavation is closing. Rising heat makes fieldwork dangerous. Unpredictable storms destroy trenches. Governments, facing their own climate crises, often lack funds to support archaeological rescue missions. The Earth is rewriting itself faster than institutions can respond. In this era of urgency, satellite archaeology becomes not just a tool, but a final refuge for knowledge. It becomes a way to preserve the coordinates of memory before the shifting sands erase them entirely. When archaeologists speak of documenting before disappearing, they are acknowledging a new chapter in their discipline, one in which discovery and loss unfold simultaneously. Perhaps this duality explains why so many describe the desert not as a void, but as a compressed archive. Beneath its surface lies the accumulated weight of thousands of years. Every dune is a page. Every radar sweep is a reading. And every anomaly is a sentence that begs to be understood. But the greatest revelation of all may be that the density of ancient settlement across these landscapes far exceeds what historians once imagined. The idea that early humans lived in sparse, scattered communities dissolves beneath the evidence. Instead, the radar reveals a world alive with movement. Caravans crossing distances we once thought impassable, farmers cultivating lands now barren, artisans working in workshops buried beneath dunes the height of cathedrals. It reveals civilizations that adapted creatively to changing climates, migrating with the landscape, shifting their economies as water ebbed and flowed, and building networks resilient enough to withstand droughts that would collapse many modern states. This recognition forces us to reconsider our own time with humility. We tend to believe our technological sophistication shields us from the vulnerabilities that toppled ancient worlds. Yet the radar tells another story. It shows us that landscapes once fertile became deserts, coastlines once secure collapsed into the sea, communities once thriving dispersed under environmental pressure. The desert is not simply history, it is prophecy. It carries within it the memory of past transformations and the warning of future ones. And through it all, the machines continue their silent vigilance. They scan, record, measure, and map. They do not sleep. They do not blink. They extend human sight into places light cannot reach. They become the eyes of future historians, cataloging a world that may vanish before it can be understood. They reveal a truth our ancestors knew, but we often forget, that nothing built upon the earth is immune to the earth's own shifting. The question that remains is not whether the desert still holds secrets. It does. The question is not whether we can find them. We can. The question is whether we will understand their meaning in time. For every hidden city revealed, another is lost. For every radar sweep completed, a storm rises. For every structure mapped, another collapses. The balance between revelation and disappearance grows more delicate each year. Yet in this delicate balance lies a profound beauty. The desert does not surrender its stories easily. But when it does so with a kind of reluctant generosity, offering glimpses into worlds that once thrived where sand now reigns. And the machines, our modern storytellers, catch these glimpses before they fade. Perhaps this is the true lesson of seeing through sand, that history is not fixed, not stable, not permanent. It is a shifting field of memory, shaped by the forces that bury and the forces that reveal. We are not masters of the past. We are its temporary guardians. And as we look upon the radar maps, glowing with the faint signatures of forgotten worlds, we realize that the desert's greatest secret is not the cities it hides, but the reminder it offers, that to see the past clearly, we must learn to see differently. Cities do not think, yet they remember. Every stone that rises into a wall, every threshold smoothed by passing feet, every courtyard shaped by the rhythm of daily life carries within it the imprint of human choice. Architecture is memory made physical, not just because it survives after people disappear, but because it records what they valued, feared, hoped for, and believed would endure long after their voices faded. When we walk among ruins, we are not entering dead spaces. We are stepping into a memory system built over centuries. What we call a city is, in truth, a vast archive written in materials far more honest than written text. Some memories are obvious. Carved pillars depicting ancestral spirits, temple steps worn concave by thousands of worshippers, storage buildings enlarged after successive years of prosperity. But the deepest memories lie in what remains unexplained. Why a city chose its location. Why its streets form a particular geometry. Why its residents abandoned it slowly. house by house, as conditions shifted around them. A vanished city is a palimpsest, its earlier meanings partially erased, its later meanings inscribed over them, its final silence concealing layers still waiting to be understood. At Carroll, in Peru's Soup Valley, the oldest known urban culture of the Americas, the landscape itself seems to breathe with remembered intention. The monumental structures, platform mounds, circular plazas, residential clusters, do not evoke war or conquest. Instead, they suggest a civilization that responded to environmental stress with coordination rather than conflict. No fortification walls surround Carroll. No weapons litter its layers. Instead, its ceremonial complexes display an ideology rooted in harmony, ritual, and shared responsibility for agricultural cycles that grew increasingly unpredictable over time. The recently revealed city of Penico, announced in 2025, expands this story even further. Its 18 edifices trace a blueprint of adaptation: storage platforms designed to regulate food distribution, communal areas that imply gatherings for decision-making, and architectural adjustments that reflect a society negotiating environmental pressures with cooperation rather than fragmentation. It is a narrative that contradicts the dominant assumption that civilization advances through competition. Penico shows an alternative possibility, that survival, especially during climatic hardship, can emerge from collective choice rather than dominance. But while the visible ruins of Carroll and its satellite cities offer insights into resilience, buried desert cities hold a different kind of memory, one concerned not with continuity, but with disappearance. These cities remember how societies end. They remember the moment when water became unreliable, when trade routes faltered, when landscapes once fertile transformed into corridors of dust. They preserve the emotional weight of decisions made in the final years, the debates over whether to stay or leave, the repairs undertaken in hope rather than confidence, the rituals performed one last time before abandonment became unavoidable. When archaeologists uncover grain storage buildings that were expanded during a city's decline, they are witnessing the optimism of people who believe their struggle was temporary. When they discover walls reinforced against advancing dunes, they are reading the determination of residents who thought they could still push the desert back. And when they find administrative tablets detailing inventory systems or trade agreements written in the final years of occupation, they see bureaucratic persistence, an instinct to maintain order even when nature had already decided otherwise. Göbekli Tepe embodies this paradox more powerfully than perhaps any other site. Its creators chose not only to build monumental enclosures, but to bury them deliberately. Each T-shaped pillar, carved with foxes, birds, and stylized human forms, was lowered into a grave of rubble and sediment. This was no accidental burial. It required immense labor, coordination, and shared intention. Why bury something so sacred? Why entomb the symbols of a worldview in darkness after centuries of reverence? Some scholars believe the builders were concluding a cosmological cycle, sealing the enclosures as part of a ritual closure. Others argue that they intentionally preserved the site for a future they could not yet imagine, a future in which their descendants, or strangers like us, might rediscover these pillars and interpret the meanings they encoded. Whatever the motive, the act reveals a profound awareness. They understood that the memory of a city or a sanctuary does not end when it is covered. Sometimes burial is preservation. Sometimes disappearance is a form of endurance. The buried cities of the Sahara and Arabian Peninsula preserve similar memories. They remember an era when caravan routes threaded across regions now described as uninhabitable. These routes once carried frankincense from southern Arabia to Mediterranean markets, linking cultures across thousands of kilometers. They crossed landscapes that were greener, wetter, and more forgiving than the deserts we see today. When these routes vanished, the cities that relied on them did not fall overnight. They faded slowly, like echoes diminishing with distance. Their final centuries were marked not by destruction but by quietness, markets growing quieter, storage pits remaining half full, wells struggling to draw water. These memories contradict much of our historical imagination. We expect civilizations to collapse with sudden drama, with fire, invasion, or catastrophe. But most do not. Most end through silence. They end through years of trying to adapt until the cost of adaptation exceeds the benefit. They end when the last family, or the last priest, or the last administrator decides that staying has become an act of denial. The ruins we excavate today record these decisions more honestly than any surviving text ever could. Cities built in the desert remember the sound of winds that grew stronger each decade. They remember the hesitation in the footsteps of residents who noticed the water table falling. They remember the final repairs made to walls already weakened by drought. They remember the moment someone closed the last door, without ceremony, without witnessing, without imagining that thousands of years later, strangers would reconstruct that moment through layers of sediment. What visible cities forget, buried cities remember in detail. Visible cities forget the emotional architecture of abandonment because their lives continue. Their streets fill with new crowds. Their buildings are renovated or reconstructed. Their energy overwrites the memory of earlier traumas. But buried cities preserve everything exactly as it was left. A broken pot remains broken. A collapsed wall remains collapsed. An unfinished repair remains unfinished. The sediment becomes a storyteller, preserving not only what survived but the precise moment when continuity ended. This memory is global. It transcends geography, climate, and culture. The Soup Valley remembers, in its architecture, how cooperation shaped resilience. Anatolia remembers, through Göbekli Tepe's burial, how rituals can conclude eras. The Sahara remembers the caravans that once crossed its plains. Arabia remembers the last wells going dry. And everywhere, the desert remembers the silence that follows the final retreat of a people who once believed their home would outlast time itself. Yet there is another kind of memory cities carry, one more troubling, more fragile, and more easily destroyed. The memory encoded in spatial relationships. The distance between a temple and a marketplace. The alignment of a sanctuary to the rising sun. The angle of a doorway designed to block prevailing winds. These relationships tell stories no artifact can capture. They reveal how people thought, moved, organized, and interacted. But the moment excavation begins, these relationships are endangered. Remove a wall, and the shadow it once cast disappears. Lift a pillar, and the sound it once reflected changes. Extract an object, and the context that gave it meaning dissolves. This loss is unavoidable, yet it is the paradox at the heart of archaeology. To reveal the past, you must disturb it. Cities remember through their materials, but they also remember through their absences, gaps, voids, and erasures that speak with equal clarity. When archaeologists uncover a sanctuary whose offerings were removed before abandonment, the emptiness itself becomes evidence. When a room contains no final layer of ash or debris, it suggests an orderly departure. When a grain silo is left half full, it implies urgency. These absences form sentences in the language of disappearance, telling us not only what people did, but what they chose not to do in their final days. It is a quiet vocabulary, yet it preserves truths more intimately than surviving inscriptions. Consider the cities of the Arabian Peninsula, where climate transformation reshaped the landscape so thoroughly that the memory of habitation itself faded. Their ruins remember a world wetter than our maps admit, a world of savannas, lakes, and river systems that supported herders, farmers, traders, and priests. Their architecture remembers seasons when rainfall patterns were predictable, when wells replenished themselves, when valleys now barren supported orchards and settlements. The dunes that bury them do not erase this memory. They seal it, preserving it for someone in the distant future to rediscover and reinterpret. These cities also remember the fragility of dependence. They remember how societies tied to a single water source became vulnerable when that source changed course. They remember how trade networks collapsed not because of war, but because shifting dunes made once stable caravan routes impassable. They remember how communities relied on collective knowledge, astronomy, hydrology, and ritual calendars to survive cycles of drought, and how those cycles sometimes stretched longer than any calendar or prophecy could anticipate. Their ruins carry these lessons silently, waiting for us to understand that the story of collapse is rarely dramatic and almost never sudden. In this way, Desert cities offer a more intimate record of humanity's relationship with its environment than any monumental inscription ever could. They show us how adaptation, resilience, and surrender coexist in delicate balance. They remind us that landscape is not a backdrop, but an active participant in the story of civilization. When the land changes, the story changes. And when the land becomes uninhabitable, the story ends. Carol and its newly revealed satellite cities remind us of a different truth, that architectural memory also encodes strategies for survival that do not rely on dominance. In the Soup Valley, where the environment is harsh even today, the ancient Carol civilization found ways to endure through cooperation. Their plazas were designed to gather people for collective ritual, reinforcing social cohesion during times of stress. Their residential sectors reveal patterns of shared labor and resource distribution. Their ceremonial structures emphasize cosmological alignment, suggesting a worldview that integrated ecological awareness with spiritual practice. This memory stands in stark contrast to societies that responded to environmental pressure with warfare, expansion, or rigid hierarchy. Carroll's architecture whispers that cooperation can be as powerful a survival strategy as competition. It shows that ritual is not mere superstition, it is a mechanism for unity. It shows that planning for scarcity can prevent collapse. And it shows that civilizations can thrive in landscapes where modern visitors struggle to imagine survival at all. But buried cities tell a more somber story. They remember not only how people lived, but how they left. They remember the last festivals held in plazas now filled with sand. They remember the final repairs to walls whose builders knew the work could not halt the advance of dunes. They remember the prayers spoken in temples shortly before their doors were sealed. They remember the moment when the final residents stood at the edge of the settlement, looked back at the only home they had ever known, and understood they would never return. Göbekli Tepe remembers even more. Its deliberate burial suggests a civilization reflecting on itself, perhaps recognizing that its worldview had reached an endpoint, or that its monumental enclosures had fulfilled their purpose. The massive effort required to fill these structures with rubble speaks of collective intention. This was not abandonment. It was closure. It was a final act of meaning-making. And because the burial preserved the site beneath layers of protective sediment, it also became a gift to the future. Whether its builders meant to send a message across time or were simply concluding a ritual tradition, the result is the same. They preserved a memory we are only now beginning to decipher. This idea, that cities can remember more clearly when they disappear, reframes how we think about ruins. A living city rewrites itself constantly. It renovates, demolishes, expands, erases, and repaints. Its memories blur as new generations overwrite the past. But a buried city preserves a single moment. It becomes a snapshot of a world paused at the brink of change. It becomes a memory sealed, not diluted. Archaeologists often speak of context as the soul of a site. The placement of a vessel beside a wall matters more than the vessel itself. The alignment of a doorway matters more than the stone used to build it. The shadow patterns cast by temples during solstices reveal cosmologies that no inscription records. Yet the moment excavation begins, context becomes fragile. Each removed layer alters the spatial relationships that encode memory. Each artifact taken to a laboratory loses the resonance it had in its original position. This paradox haunts every excavation. To understand the past, we must dismantle the very structure that preserves it. Buried cities avoid this fate by freezing context in place. Their memories remain intact until uncovered. And once uncovered, those memories confront us with uncomfortable reflections of our own world. They remind us that environmental change is relentless, indifferent, and often invisible until it is too late. They remind us that societies collapse not only from dramatic catastrophes, but from prolonged imbalance, soil degradation, declining water tables, shifting trade routes, and subtle climatic changes that accumulate over generations. They remind us that the most dangerous threats are those that build slowly, surpassing thresholds long before people recognize their magnitude. Modern cities, with their glittering skylines and dense populations, rarely imagine themselves vulnerable in this way. Yet ancient cities were no less confident. They built monumental architecture to invoke permanence, just as we do. They developed sophisticated administrative systems, just as we have. They relied on stable climate patterns, just as we do. And when those patterns shifted, they responded with resilience, until resilience was no longer enough. The memories encoded in buried cities whisper a warning. Continuity is a story we tell ourselves, not a guarantee offered by the world. But these memories also offer hope. They show us that collapse does not erase everything. Knowledge migrates. Skills persist. Cultural practices adapt. Communities relocate, merge, or reinvent themselves. The burial of a city does not signify the death of its people. It signifies transformation. The desert remembers the routes people took as they migrated, carrying their traditions into new landscapes. Carol remembers the ways people reorganized their society to endure environmental stress. Göbekli Tepe remembers how a civilization concluded a monumental epoch with ritual rather than abandonment. Nabta Playa remembers an ancient cosmology shaped by the alignment of stars. And every buried city remembers the same lesson, that the earth is not static, that human survival depends on reading the landscape with humility, and that memory, whether in stone, sand, or silence, is always speaking. The final truth cities remember is this: civilizations do not vanish when they are buried. They vanish when we stop listening. Depth is time made vertical. When you dig into the earth, you dig backward through memory, descending through worlds layered atop one another like the pages of an endless book. Every meter down is another century. Every stratum is another civilization. And buried within each layer is the evidence of choices made, hopes carried, fears confronted, and failures endured. Cities are not simply abandoned, they are overwritten. And yet, they never fully disappear. They linger beneath their successors, their outlines softened, their meanings transformed, their stories compressed into the architecture of the ground itself. In places like Göbekli Tepe, this vertical memory is almost overwhelming. Excavations have revealed not one sanctuary, but a sequence of them, 8 distinct phases spanning more than 1,000 years. Later builders repaired the walls of earlier enclosures, propped up sagging pillars, reshaped the layouts of spaces they inherited but did not fully understand, and constructed terraces to keep the slopes from sliding. They worked amid the bones of their ancestors' architecture, modifying forms whose original purpose had grown distant. And when yet another slope failure swept rubble and deposits downhill, burying building C and damaging enclosure D, they responded once more with stabilization efforts, determined to preserve the structures even as nature undermined their attempts. But these cycles of construction, collapse, and repair were not infinite. In the early 8th millennium BCE, the people of Göbekli Tepe abandoned the site entirely. Whether the decision arose from spiritual transition, environmental stress, or shifting cosmologies, the result was the same. They filled their sacred enclosures with stone and sediment, creating artificial hills that sealed their memory beneath layers of earth. Surface surveys suggest that what archaeologists have uncovered is only a fraction of what remains. Magnetic gradiometry reveals hints of far more enclosures beneath the ground, densely packed structures waiting for a future generation to decipher. The visible pillars may be only the crest of a buried mountain of meaning. If Göbekli Tepe represents the deliberate burial of memory, the ancient Sumerian city of Ur represents memory accumulated through continuous life. Ur is not a ruin, it is a vertical biography. Rising 20 meters above the plain, its mound contains millennia of occupation. Gemmed at Nasser foundations overlaid by early dynastic houses, topped by old Babylonian modifications, capped by Kassite structures, then smoothed by later periods until the city became not a collection of buildings, but a geological formation. Its growth from 15 hectares to more than 100 reflects population expansions, economic cycles, political shifts, and cultural reinterpretations. Every time a wall collapsed, new inhabitants built atop it. Every time a street filled with debris, they paved a fresh surface above. And each choice became another layer in the city's memory. Across the northern Mesopotamian plain, hundreds of tells rise from the earth, artificial hills built entirely from the remains of successive generations. They look like natural landforms, but each is a stratigraphic archive. Digging into a tell means entering a vertical city, one where houses from different eras sit atop each other like stacked epics. Some layers record prosperity, thicker walls, imported ceramics, expanding neighborhoods. Others record decline, smaller houses, reused materials, shrinking footprints. The tells remember growth and contraction equally. But desert cities introduce a paradox that overturns this vertical logic. When sand buries a city, it does not compress its layers into geological sequence. It preserves them horizontally, freezing the entire urban plan in a single moment. Streets remain streets. Doorways remain aligned. Neighborhoods remain intact. A buried desert city is a photograph rather than a palimpsest, a snapshot of the last day people walked through it. There is no vertical remixing of eras. The city does not become a mound. It becomes a sealed time capsule. And unlike tells, where the earliest layers lie deepest, in a sand-buried city, the youngest layer sits intact beneath the dunes, untouched, unmixed, waiting. This is why SER-generated 3D models feel so haunting. They do not reveal only buildings. They reveal relationships. They show how public and private spaces interacted, how alleys connected households, how courtyards mediated light and airflow, how marketplaces branched off from main streets, how administrative buildings dominated central axes. These relationships are often destroyed in traditional excavation, where uncovering deeper layers requires removing later ones. But when a sandstorm preserves everything horizontally, context survives in perfect spatial configuration. Perhaps the most poignant memories come from the evidence of return. After a city's primary occupation layer ends, small groups often come back, not to rebuild, but to live among the ruins. They construct modest dwellings against ancient walls, repurpose collapsed foundations, and inhabit the ghost architecture of a society larger than their own. These returnees did not attempt restoration. They lived within the remains of structures whose functions they could not fully grasp. They walked through abandoned plazas that once held ceremonies they no longer understood. They scavenged materials from monuments built by ancestors whose intentions had faded into myth. Their presence creates one of archaeology's most haunting questions. What does it mean to inhabit the corpse of a city? To return to a city without understanding it is to experience time as dislocation. The returnees who lived within the abandoned phases of Göbekli Tepe, UR, or the countless unnamed desert settlements knew they were walking through the architecture of a world greater than their own. They recognized the stones, but not the stories. They saw the pillars, but not the rituals. They walked streets whose purposes had dissolved. Inhabiting ruins collapses chronology. It forces the present to coexist with the monumental ghosts of the past, filling daily life with a sense of scale that can be both empowering and unsettling. Archaeological traces of such returnees are delicate but unmistakable. Hearths built in the corners of ceremonial rooms, temporary shelters leaning against walls once carved with cosmological symbols, domestic debris interrupting sacred architecture. These clues reveal not only reuse, but reinterpretation. A sanctuary becomes a house. A plaza becomes a corral. A collapsed enclosure becomes a windbreak. People adapt the grandeur of the past to the simplicity of their needs. In doing so, they create an unexpected layer of meaning, the memory of living in someone else's memory. This phenomenon is not isolated. Across the Middle East, Anatolia, North Africa, and Central Asia, countless sites show evidence of secondary occupation centuries after primary abandonment. In some cases, the returnees were pastoralists seeking shelter. In others, refugees fleeing conflict. In still others, small communities attempting to revive what remained of a once thriving world. These returnees often left behind few artifacts, their lives materially simpler than those of the civilizations preceding them. But the mere act of living inside ruins transforms the architectural memory of a site. It becomes a dialogue between builders who imagined permanence and survivors who understood impermanence intimately. Such patterns expose a truth that modern societies rarely contemplate. Cities do not vanish cleanly. They linger, degrade, transform, and are repurposed. A ruin is not an endpoint, it is a transition. Beneath every city lies another city, and beneath that, another still. And even when new structures are not built above them, human presence does not entirely disappear. Memory persists through habitation as much as through abandonment. The paradox becomes sharper when we compare tells with sand-buried sites. Tells compress memory. They form because people rebuild atop their own debris, layering each generation's architecture upon the last. Over centuries, this creates a vertical archive so dense that archaeologists must peel back layers like pages, moving through time as they descend. But sand-buried sites preserve memory horizontally, freezing the final chapter of a city in perfect spatial clarity. There is no vertical distortion, no compression of centuries into meters of debris. Instead, there is an urban imprint intact as the day it was left. This difference dramatically affects what cities can tell us about themselves. Tells speak of continuity, one structure replacing another, one layer of meaning overriding the last. Sand-buried cities speak of interruption, lives halted, plans abandoned, rhythms broken. A tell is the memory of endurance. A sand-buried site is the memory of rupture. And yet, beneath both lies another phenomenon revealed by satellite archaeology. Entire layers of urban development that neither excavation nor surface survey has yet touched. At UR, satellite imagery shows square buildings, long walls, and road outlines stretching beyond the visible ruins, structures that excavators cannot yet explain. These anomalies are neither fully present nor absent. They exist in data, but not in trenches. They form a ghost city beneath the known city, a realm of shapes, without confirmed stories. This dual presence, simultaneously discovered and undiscovered, creates a new category of archaeological mystery, the city that exists only in spectral form. Göbekli Tepe presents a similar duality. Magnetic surveys detect countless additional enclosures beneath the ground, yet excavators have touched only a handful. What we see, the iconic central pillars, is a fragment of a far larger landscape. The true city may be 10 times greater than the exposed portion. This revelation transforms the site from a discrete sanctuary into a monumental ceremonial complex, whose full narrative remains hidden. Beneath the known Göbekli Tepe lies an unknown Göbekli Tepe, a shadow version waiting for a future that may never come if climate conditions continue to destabilize the region. The most haunting aspect is the evidence of decline preserved inside these layered cities. In Göbekli Tepe's later phases, enclosures B and D were lost. Phase 6 reveals reduced construction intensity. Phase 7 shows attempts to build new structures, but smaller, less ambitious. Phase 8 contains modest habitation structures built within the abandoned Neolithic village, a clear sign of contraction. This is urban memory recording not growth, but retreat. Cities do not only expand. They shrink. They lose confidence. They consolidate. They adapt until adaptation fails. Their spatial footprint becomes the map of their struggle. The same pattern appears across Mesopotamia. As UR declined, its occupied area shrank drastically. Later residents clustered around certain temples or administrative centers while leaving peripheral neighborhoods to decay. These shrinking zones form an archaeological fingerprint of collapse, a kind of reverse urbanism where density increases even as population falls. The ruins record this process in ways texts never mention. Clay tablets preserve transactions, offerings, and rituals, but architecture preserves fear, urgency, and dwindling resilience. Layered cities also remember the trauma of environmental instability. When rivers shifted away from settlements, lower layers show rich sediments, while upper layers show dust accumulation. When irrigation systems failed, earlier floors show activity, later floors show abandonment. When trade networks collapsed, imported goods vanish from upper strata. These patterns, stacked vertically, become a narrative of decline as precise as any chronicle. But perhaps the most profound memory cities preserve is the memory of misunderstanding. The people who returned to Göbekli Tepe after its grand enclosures were buried lived amid carvings whose meanings they could not decipher. The inhabitants who resettled older Mesopotamian tells walked streets built by ancestors whose stories were lost. The scavengers who lived among the ruins of desert cities inherited architecture but not intention. They moved through a material world stripped of context, just as we now excavate ruins whose meanings elude us. In this mirror, we recognize ourselves. We, too, inhabit the remnants of civilizations we cannot fully comprehend. We stand atop layers of meaning we did not create. We walk streets shaped by decisions long forgotten. And as we excavate cities whose builders are silent, we glimpse a future in which our own cities may be misunderstood by those who come after. This is what layered cities remember, not just the worlds that rose and fell, but the countless worlds that tried to return. To understand the cities beneath the cities, you must understand that time is not horizontal in the ancient world. It is sedimented. It settles. It thickens. It seeps downward like water through soil. Every generation leaves something of itself behind: an oven foundation, a broken pot, a collapsed roof beam, a street repaved for the 10th or the 50th time. And these deposits accumulate, millimeter by millimeter, until a house becomes a hill and a city becomes a geological formation. To dig into such a place is to descend through human experience the way a diver moves through layers of temperature in deep water. Yet desert-buried cities are different. They do not deepen, they freeze. They preserve the day the wind arrived, the week the wells failed, the season the inhabitants walked away. Vertical tells capture the continuity of living memory. Sand-buried cities capture the instant memory dissolves. And both types carry truths archaeology cannot ignore. One of the strangest truths revealed by layered cities is that decline often leaves clearer traces than growth. When a city expands, it does so organically. Houses multiply, streets extend, courtyards fill, the layers blend in complexity. But when a city contracts, when its population dwindles, when its confidence falters, when its borders shrink, the change becomes architectural. Certain districts fall quiet. Certain workshops go unused. Certain communal structures remain active while others decay. Collapse is not only a historical event, it is a spatial pattern. This pattern repeats across civilizations. At Ur, the outer neighborhoods fell into disuse long before the central temples extinguished their fires. At Hattusa, outer fortifications became irrelevant before the inner courtyards lost their purpose. At Mohenjo-daro, the southern mound diminished in activity while the citadel remained occupied. Archaeology remembers these asymmetries even when texts do not. Decline is rarely uniform. It is selective, and the ground keeps the record. Layered cities also preserve the ambiguity of belief. When a catastrophic event occurs, flood, fire, earthquake, the layer left behind is sharp, distinct, undeniable. But most cultural transitions happen gradually. A change in ritual practice produces subtle shifts in architectural orientation. A shift in political authority changes the distribution of storage facilities, not the construction of fortresses. A modification in social hierarchy alters the placement of hearths inside houses, not the height of walls. These nuances are easily lost in excavation, but they leave imprints in the intricate sandwich of layers that compose a tell. By contrast, in sand-buried cities, ritual spaces remain frozen. A shrine may still contain offerings from the last ceremony. A priestly walkway may preserve the exact pattern of footsteps. An administrative room may still hold clay tablets left on a shelf at the moment officials realized there was no future left to administer. This fidelity to the final instant is what makes desert-buried cities uniquely haunting. They do not reveal evolution, they reveal cessation. Yet even this cessation is not the end. Many cities exhibit evidence of reoccupation, brief, shallow layers of activity above the collapsed grandeur of earlier ages. In some cases, these reoccupations were temporary shelters for nomads seeking protection from storms. In others, they were clusters of domestic pits dug by people who recognized the strategic value of the mound but had no desire to rebuild its former glory. In still others, they were spiritual pilgrims visiting the abandoned city as a site of memory or reverence. Each reoccupation adds a thin, ghostly layer that complicates interpretation. These returnees lived among the bones of a vanished world, their modest presence contrasting with the monumental architecture beneath them. This relationship between magnitude and modesty forms one of the most moving elements of stratigraphic archaeology. A grand temple built with massive blocks may be capped by a thin layer of ash from a shepherd's fire. A formal plaza may be overlain by a few centimeters of domestic refuse from a family living centuries after the city's abandonment. A massive administrative building may bear the faint trace of a goat pen erected by people who had no awareness of the bureaucratic power once concentrated at that exact location. These juxtapositions reveal that memory is not linear, it is recursive. The past becomes habitat for the future, even when the future does not understand the past it inhabits. This recursive layering also exposes the limits of excavation. For archaeologists, every decision is a sacrifice. To uncover the deeper layers, they must remove the upper ones. To understand the earliest periods of a city, they must destroy the evidence of the latest. This dilemma haunts every trench. Which memory deserves to survive? Which layer is more important? In a tell, removing soil means removing history. In a sand-buried city, even brushing away dunes risks altering spatial relationships that have remained untouched for thousands of years. Magnetic surveys and satellite imagery exacerbate this dilemma. They reveal buildings that excavation cannot reach, structures visible in geophysical data but absent when trenches are cut. These ghost structures complicate the archaeological imagination. They exist, yet they do not exist. They are present in numbers, geometric clarity, and signature, but absent in touch, texture, materiality. They occupy a liminal space between detection and understanding. And because excavation is slow while detection is instant, their numbers grow faster than archaeologists can follow. In some regions, this has created an entire landscape of phantom cities, mapped, identified, but unexcavated, vulnerable to erosion, development, or shifting dunes. These cities beneath the cities are not only literal, they are conceptual. They represent the layer of potential knowledge beneath the layer of confirmed knowledge. They challenge us to accept that we may never know the full extent of human settlement, that the visible archaeology of the world is only a sliver of its ancient reality. The deepest irony is that the people who built these layers often lived with similar blind spots. They, too, built upon the ruins of worlds they did not fully understand. They, too, saw outlines of walls from earlier eras without knowing who raised them. They, too, walked streets shaped by ancestors whose names were forgotten. In this, modern archaeology mirrors ancient life more closely than we realize. We excavate ruins with partial understanding. They inhabited ruins with partial understanding. The cities beneath the cities are a reminder that all human societies inherit more than they comprehend. What truly binds these layered cities together is the quiet persistence of human intention. Every foundation stone placed, every wall rebuilt, every room repurposed is a trace of someone trying to shape their world into meaning. And when these intentions accumulate over centuries, they form landscapes where time becomes architectural. You can walk through a tell and feel the centuries rising beneath your feet. You can stand at the base of a dune and sense the frozen instant a city vanished beneath drifted sands. Both forms carry a message that is easy to ignore. History is not a sequence of events, but a physical texture. It thickens, it settles, it folds into itself. Yet even in these folded textures, the most overlooked layer may be the one built from absence. Archaeologists often speak of negative space, the places where people did not build, did not return, did not repair. A street narrowed in a later phase speaks of pressure. A courtyard filled in speaks of abandonment. A temple left unfinished speaks of crisis. These voids act as counterweights to the material layers above them. Just as silence shapes music, absence shapes memory. And in the cities beneath the cities, silence becomes a stratigraphic feature in its own right. We see this clearly in the phenomenon of partial returns. Not every reoccupation leaves a dense layer. Sometimes only a few hearths, a handful of flint blades, or a thin scatter of animal bones mark a new phase of life. These traces show us that the instinct to return is rarely driven by nostalgia. It is driven by practicality. Ruins offer shelter, height, defense, and familiarity. But reoccupation also reveals another psychological truth. Even when people do not understand a site's full history, they recognize that it has history. They sense that the stones beneath them have witnessed something significant. They live not just in a place, but in a presence. This presence shapes behavior. People treat monumental ruins with a strange mixture of reverence and indifference. They repurpose ancient walls as boundaries for sheep pens, yet avoid disturbing certain carved stones. They build hearths on broken altars, but leave prominent pillars untouched. These patterns suggest an instinctual respect, a feeling that some parts of the abandoned city retain a kind of dormant power. And in this instinct, we glimpse an echo of our own fascination with ruins. We, too, stand before ancient architecture with a mix of awe and projection. We, too, sense the weight of stories not fully understood. But there is another layer beneath the physical layers, an invisible architecture built from memory itself. Cities remember not just through stone and sand, but through the way their forms affect those who inhabit them. A narrow alley preserves the rhythm of footsteps even when its builders vanish. A plaza remembers collective gatherings in the shape of its open space. A temple remembers ritual movement in the curvature of its access routes. These spatial memories survive even when belief systems change. They guide behavior across generations, long after the original meanings have been forgotten. This is why archaeological maps often reveal repeated patterns across millennia. Houses align along similar axes. Communal structures occupy the same elevated areas. Storage facilities cluster in consistent zones. Even when new cultures arrive, they sense the optimal placement of certain functions. Geography collaborates with memory to shape continuity. This convergence is what makes deep excavations so moving. Each layer confirms that human beings, separated by centuries, often make similar choices when confronted with similar landscapes. And yet, in the deserts where cities lie horizontally preserved beneath sand, this continuity breaks. These cities freeze in forms that would never have evolved. They represent the final version of a world that no longer had time to change. A marketplace that might have moved. A shrine that might have been rebuilt. A neighborhood that might have expanded, all frozen by environmental catastrophe or gradual decline. These preserved layouts allow archaeologists to reconstruct social dynamics with extraordinary clarity, which homes faced public spaces, which workshops clustered near water sources, which roads linked segments of the population. They reveal a whole society's structure crystallized in its last configuration. But even this clarity raises unsettling questions. If a sand-buried city survived intact because its inhabitants did not remain long enough to alter it, then its very preservation is evidence of its failure. The cities we can understand most precisely are the ones that ended abruptly. The cities we can map in perfect detail are the ones that never lived to evolve. Preservation becomes a form of elegy, an architectural obituary inscribed not in words, but in undisturbed alignment. This irony deepens when we consider cities that never fully disappeared. Some tells contain more than 20 superimposed layers of habitation, each representing a revival, a reinvention, a refusal to let the land fall silent. These layered cities remember persistence more than collapse. They testify to the resilience of communities who rebuilt again and again, each time leaving a new chapter beneath the soil. But even these cities eventually falter. Their last layers show thinner occupation, fewer imported goods, simpler construction, and smaller footprints. They record the moment continuity broke. And now, as we excavate them, we occupy a similar position to the returnees who lived among ancient ruins. We understand fragments. We hypothesize meanings. We draw connections from incomplete evidence. We know that what lies beneath us is profound, but we also know we will never see it whole. The cities beneath the cities remind us that understanding the past is always partial, always provisional, always layered. Perhaps this is their final lesson. Civilizations do not disappear cleanly. They descend into the earth in stages, each layer a negotiation between endurance and surrender. They become part of the landscape, then part of the soil, then part of memory, then part of imagination. The deeper we dig, the more we learn, not only about them, but about ourselves. For we are not the first to inherit the ruins of forgotten worlds, and we will not be the last. In the end, The cities beneath the cities whisper the same truth across every layer. What rises will fall, what falls will be buried, and what is buried will one day be sought again. The desert is often imagined as emptiness, an expanse of silence, of repetition, of horizon without narrative. But this is the greatest misunderstanding we have inherited from modern maps. A desert is not empty. It is a library whose shelves are dunes, whose archives are buried chambers, whose cataloging system is the wind. The grains of sand that sweep across the Sahara and the Rub al-Khali are not symbols of lifelessness. They are pages. And each page holds the memory of a world that once thrived where dryness now reigns. The wind is the archivist. It gathers fragments of architecture and buries them with patient precision. It erodes surfaces but preserves depth. It strips away what is frail but seals what is strong. And over thousands of years, it creates an archive larger than any library humanity has ever built. The Sahara alone spans 9 million square kilometers, an ocean of dunes whose movement masks the fact that beneath them lie valleys, lakes, riverbeds, and cities from eras when the land was savanna rather than wasteland. The Rub al-Khali covers more than 600,000 square kilometers, the largest continuous sand desert in the world, and likely the densest concentration of unexcavated ancient settlements on Earth. These are not empty landscapes. They are overfull, saturated with the remains of civilizations that flourished in climates long forgotten. Yet until recently, our understanding of deserts came from what little remained visible: a fragment of pottery here, a half-buried wall there, a single exposed pillar caught between dunes. We studied what the wind allowed to stay uncovered, never grasping that the wind was not scattering the record, it was organizing it. Beneath the dunes lie the chapters we never opened. The real story of early human civilization may not be in the cities we celebrate for surviving. It may be in the cities that disappeared so thoroughly the world forgot they existed. This realization is reshaping archaeology. For centuries, excavators worked with the limits of human sight and the slowness of human labor. They dug trenches, measured walls, sifted sediment. But a trench reveals only what a team can uncover in a season, and a desert is a continent. No matter how determined archaeologists were, they could only scratch its surface. Then came the machines that could see through sand. Satellite-based synthetic aperture radar reads the desert the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Radio waves penetrate dunes and reflect off buried architecture, sketching outlines of structures that haven't been touched in millennia. Algorithms sift these signals, identifying anomalies, straight lines that might be walls, rectangular patches that might be foundations, networks of faint paths that might be the echoes of ancient trade routes. Artificial intelligence processes entire regions in weeks, producing maps of buried cities faster than any excavation team could survey a single valley. Suddenly, the dunes are no longer opaque. They are translucent. The desert's archive is open to inspection. But this acceleration comes with a new kind of crisis. The more we see, the more we understand we cannot reach. Every anomaly identified by AI is a question without an answer, a city without a story, a record we have no time to decipher. Climate change compounds the urgency. Drought reveals ruins, but sandstorms rebury them. Temperature extremes fracture exposed architecture. Salt carried in desert winds infiltrates ancient brick, causing it to crumble. Archaeologists now speak with excitement tinged by dread. They are standing in the only window in human history when technology can see through sand, but climate has not yet erased what lies beneath. This window is narrow, precarious. If the dunes advance further, the archive will close, and buried sites are vanishing faster than they can be documented. In Iran's Dasht-i-Lut, surveys identified 87 ancient sites from the 5th millennium BCE to the Islamic era, most already covered by dunes, many threatened by annual sandstorms that move entire landscapes within a season. In Sistan, more than 1,000 villages have been abandoned in the past century as desertification accelerates, adding modern settlements to the long lineage of buried ancient ones. As climate change intensifies, what was once a slow natural process becomes an archaeological emergency. Some sites may be buried so deeply within years that future generations will not even know where to look. Yet in this unfolding crisis lies something profound. The deserts do not merely hold cities, they hold warnings. They remember the process that turned savannas into wastelands. They remember the climatic thresholds that forced ancient populations to migrate. They remember the creeping aridity that hollowed out once thriving regions. When we uncover a buried city, we are not merely discovering a civilization. We are discovering the moment that civilization realized its world was ending. These silent ruins say what inscriptions rarely admit. Climate can end a culture as effectively as war. Rain can stop falling. Rivers can shift. Sand can move. A city can be erased without ever being conquered. This is the archive the wind built. Not just a record of what existed, but a record of how it ceased to exist. And perhaps, in reading it, we are not just learning about the past. We are reading a prophecy. If the wind is the archivist of deserts, then time is its collaborator, slow, relentless, impartial. Together they curate a library where every buried settlement becomes a sealed chapter, every dune a page turned, every rediscovery a moment when the past flickers briefly into the present. Yet as our tools grow sharper and our vision penetrates deeper into the sand, a strange paradox emerges. The more clearly we see the buried world, the more sharply we feel how fleeting our access to it is. Technology opens the archive, but climate is closing it. Consider what it means for a desert to warm by 4 degrees Celsius within 3 decades, a scenario climate scientists deem increasingly likely across the Middle East and North Africa. 4 degrees is not an abstraction. It changes wind regimes, accelerates dune migration, increases evaporation, and destabilizes the fragile balance that keeps ruins exposed. An excavation that is open today may be buried next year. A wall visible on Wednesday may vanish under a storm on Thursday. A newly identified settlement might never be studied at all because the sand reclaims it faster than any team can respond. The archive is vast, but the reading window is shrinking. This tension between discovery and disappearance shapes the emotional landscape of modern archaeology. Researchers celebrate each new detection as a revelation, but recognize that detection without preservation is only half a triumph. A city seen from space but never excavated becomes a kind of ghost, present in data, absent in memory. It exists only as a cluster of signals, a set of coordinates, a pattern the wind might erase entirely before a single brush touches the ground. And this raises a troubling question. What responsibilities do we have toward ruins we cannot save? Excavation has always been selective. Even in stable climates, archaeologists choose what to dig and what to leave untouched. But now the stakes are different. Leaving a site untouched may no longer mean preserving it for the future. It may mean surrendering it to erasure. Thousands of anomalies detected across desert regions may never become excavations. They may remain lines on maps, digital silhouettes of forgotten worlds. The archive will contain chapters we could have read but didn't, chapters the wind will seal permanently. And yet, the deserts do not simply hold their stories passively. They alter them. The sand preserves what rain would dissolve, but it also reshapes context. A city buried quickly might freeze its final day with extraordinary clarity, but layers of sand can shift architecture out of place, collapse roofs, or fill rooms in ways that obscure sequences of occupation. Some sites survive as pristine snapshots. Others survive as puzzles missing crucial pieces. The archivist is meticulous, but not gentle. Even so, the deserts offer something no other environment does: scale. The sheer immensity of the landscapes involved suggests that what we have uncovered so far is only the smallest fragment of a much larger story. If the Sahara once supported lakes the size of small seas, if rivers flowed where dunes now rise, if human populations thrived across regions now considered inhospitable, then the buried archaeological record could fundamentally rewrite our understanding of early civilization. We often think of the Fertile Crescent as the cradle of cities, but deserts might reveal parallel cradles, cultures that built, traded, worshipped, and migrated across green savannas that later dried into silence. And this possibility forces us to reconsider the map of human origins. What if the first networks of trade and ritual extended across territories now deemed uninhabitable? What if certain innovations, agricultural, astronomical, symbolic, emerged not in river valleys, but in transitional zones where climate required extraordinary adaptability. The archive beneath the dunes may contain answers that overturn familiar timelines. Yet answers require interpretation, and interpretation requires access, a commodity decreasing by the year. Desertification today is faster, more aggressive, and more unpredictable than anything ancient peoples experienced. Human activity accelerates natural processes. Groundwater depletion dries soils. Overgrazing removes vegetation. Damming redirects rivers. And rising temperatures intensify sandstorm seasons. Each factor contributes to a feedback loop in which archaeology becomes both more urgent and more fragile. In Iran's Sistan region, the abandonment of more than 1,000 villages in recent decades shows how modern communities are joining the long lineage of buried settlements. These new layers will one day confuse future archaeologists, who must distinguish between ancient collapse and contemporary displacement. The desert's archive expands not only backward but forward, accumulating evidence of the present with the same neutrality it applies to the past. The wind does not care which century a structure belongs to. It shelves everything. This collapsing distinction between ancient and modern abandonment is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the archive. When we uncover a buried city, we are not simply looking at the distant past. We are glimpsing a pattern that still unfolds. Every ruined house beneath a dune mirrors a house falling empty today. Every migration triggered by ancient drought echoes migrations driven by modern climate shifts. The archive is not a relic. It is a mirror, and that mirror reflects a truth civilizations often refuse to acknowledge. Permanence is conditional. Cities endure only as long as climate allows. A shift in rainfall patterns, a drop in river volume, a change in wind direction. These subtle forces reshape history more profoundly than armies. What happened to those ancient cities was not exceptional. It was environmental mathematics. And the same mathematics is unfolding again. Perhaps this is why the deserts feel prophetic. Their buried streets speak softly but unmistakably. Everything built can be unbuilt. Everything known can be forgotten. Everything visible can be covered. Civilizations are not erased in dramatic bursts, but in slow drifts of sand and silence. And if we listen carefully, the archive the wind built is not only preserving the past, it is warning the future. To speak of the desert as an archive is to accept that the earth remembers even when we forget, and that the wind is not a destroyer but a custodian with its own logic. It keeps what water would wash away and hides what might otherwise be scattered. But the archive is not passive, it curates. It decides what to preserve and what to erase, shaping the story of civilization long before archaeologists attempt to read it. And in this curation lies a mystery. Why are some cities sealed intact beneath dunes while others vanish without a trace? Why does one settlement preserve its final day so clearly that vessels remain upright on floors, while another dissolves into indistinguishable sediment? The desert chooses its memory not by intention but by coincidence. The timing of a sandstorm, the angle of a collapsing roof, the gradual shift of wind corridors across centuries. What we interpret as archaeological significance may simply be the outcome of environmental luck. This randomness gives the archive its peculiar power. It does not preserve the greatest cities, only the most well-timed. A dune blown across the right valley at the right moment might protect a city whose influence was minor. A storm arriving too early might erase a capital whose kings commanded armies. History becomes uneven, guided by forces indifferent to human importance. This unevenness is a challenge for archaeology, but a revelation for humility. It reminds us that memory is not merit-based, it is circumstance-based. What survives is not what was greatest, but what was sheltered. In this landscape of selective preservation, technology becomes the tool that flattens chance. AI-assisted surveys scan regions square kilometer by square kilometer, detecting the faint signatures of forgotten settlements buried so deeply that no human eye will ever see even a fragment on the surface. These signatures are often so subtle, variations in soil compactness, buried wall shadows revealed through radar phase shifts, that they exist only in mathematical form. A city becomes a pattern before it becomes a discovery. And this is the strangeness of our age. We are finding cities that we cannot touch. Their existence is known, but their stories remain sealed. We can map them, but not excavate them. We know their outlines, but not their objects. These are cities suspended in limbo, visible only as data, vanished as places. They are entries in the archive whose pages we cannot turn. And yet their presence expands our understanding of how widespread early civilizations truly were. Desert archaeology is no longer the search for isolated oases of culture. It is the unveiling of entire landscapes of habitation. The Sahara, once thought to be a barrier, may have been a corridor, a connective tissue of settlements linked by rivers during the Green Sahara periods. The Arabian Peninsula, now crossed by dunes, may have supported networks of pastoral farms, ritual sites, and proto-urban communities extending thousands of kilometers. We once believed deserts marked the limits of antiquity. Now we understand they mark its concealments. But uncovering these concealed worlds comes with decisions that weigh heavier than ever before. Excavation is not simply a matter of digging. It is the act of sacrificing part of the archive to understand another part. To dig is to destroy. Every trench opened eliminates the possibility of reading that portion differently in the future. And with climate change accelerating the burial of known sites, archaeologists face an impossible calculus. Which cities do we rescue? Which chapters do we allow the wind to claim? What knowledge do we prioritize when time is running out? This urgency is sharpened by an irony that no archaeologist escapes. The story we are uncovering is about climate shaping civilization, and we are uncovering it at the very moment climate may erase our ability to read it. The past is warning us with its silence, even as the present attempts to silence that warning again. In regions like the Dashti Lut, the dunes move with such speed that entire surveys become outdated within a single season. Anomalies identified in spring may be inaccessible by autumn. In Sistan, abandoned villages are already half swallowed by encroaching sands, creating a fusion of ancient and modern layers that future excavators may mistake for a single era. Desertification does not merely hide cities. It merges millennia, blending timelines into a single drifting topography. Context blurs. Interpretation becomes guesswork. The archive folds in on itself. And amid all this, the question grows heavier. What if the cities buried beneath deserts are not simply records of the past, but rehearsals of our future? What if the climates that consumed them are returning in forms shaped by modern human activity? Each buried street becomes a parable. Each vanished settlement becomes a caution. Each rediscovered city becomes a mirror held up to our own moment of environmental imbalance. The desert, in its silence, speaks a language we are only beginning to learn. It says, these cities believed they were permanent too. To read the archive the wind built is to stand between two immensities, one beneath your feet and one unfolding around you. The buried cities whisper their warnings upward through layers of sand, while the shifting dunes whisper their own message downward, reminding us that burial is not a historical event, but a continuous process with no intention of stopping. And in this dialogue, between what the earth preserved and what the climate continues to erase, lies the most fragile moment archaeology has ever known. For thousands of years, the desert was stable enough to hold its memories. Now it is waking, and its restlessness threatens everything within it. In some regions, dunes migrate up to 20 meters in a single year. In others, sandstorms last for days, stripping newly exposed walls until nothing remains but the shadows recorded by radar. Archaeologists speak of spending entire seasons documenting only what they know cannot be saved. They work knowing that each uncovered artifact may be the last of its kind ever seen. And through this urgency rises an unsettling truth. We are no longer uncovering ruins. We are racing against their disappearance. This race is not only scientific, but philosophical. Every buried city forces us to confront the thin line between endurance and erasure, between permanence and illusion. Civilizations often imagine themselves anchored, immune to the slow violence of climate. Yet the archive beneath the dunes is full of cities that believe the same thing. Their monuments were grand. Their economies complex. Their rituals deeply rooted. None of it protected them from drought, from shifting monsoons, from rivers that abandoned their channels, from winds that change direction. Their ruins are warnings carved not in stone, but in absence. And the desert keeps these warnings meticulously. It remembers the angle of a collapsed roof, the direction of an evacuation, the final occupation layer on a street that once echoed with voices. It remembers the narrowing of a marketplace as populations dwindled, the abandonment of outer neighborhoods as resources strained, the shrinking of ceremonial centers as belief systems faltered under environmental pressure. These are not just traces of architecture. They are traces of emotion, of fear, of adaptation, of quiet resignation. The wind did not erase these stories. It sealed them. Yet as we recover them, another unease takes shape. The archive is bigger than we can read. Technology reveals more sites than the discipline can handle. Every new survey produces dozens, sometimes hundreds, of potential excavations. Most will never be opened. Most will remain anomalies in a database. And this raises a haunting question. What does it mean to know that a city exists but choose not to uncover its story? What does it mean to knowingly allow memory to remain buried? Some archaeologists argue that excavation is itself a destructive act, that leaving sites untouched may preserve them for future technologies. But climate change complicates this hope. Preservation requires stability, and stability is disappearing. A site left for the future may not survive long enough to meet the future. The dunes do not pause for ethics. They do not wait for funding cycles. They do not postpone burial because scholars need more time. The wind is patient with the past, but impatient with the present. And so we stand at a crossroads no previous generation has faced. We possess tools capable of revealing entire lost landscapes, yet we live in a climate capable of erasing them faster than our tools can interpret them. This contradiction defines our moment. We can see more than ever, but we can save less. The archive is open wider than ever, but its pages are being torn out by the very forces that preserve them. Perhaps this is why the emotional weight of desert archaeology feels heavier now. It is not nostalgia. It is a recognition that memory is slipping through our fingers. We are reading chapters at the last possible moment. In some regions, archaeologists have returned after a year's absence to find their trenches filled, their markers gone, their careful documentation ruined by storms. They dig again, knowing the cycle will repeat. The desert archives everything, including our attempts to unarchive it. But in this struggle, there is also meaning. The act of excavation becomes a dialogue with time. Each brush stroke becomes a defiance against forgetting. Each mapped wall becomes a refusal to let silence triumph. And the more we uncover, the more we realize that the buried cities never sought to teach us about their glory. They sought to teach us about their fragility. If we learn only that lesson, perhaps it is enough. For the archive the wind built is not only historical, it is prophetic. It shows us that climate can reshape civilizations with a subtlety that goes unnoticed until the change becomes irreversible. It shows us that migrations, abandonments, and collapses are not romantic myths, but environmental events. It shows us that the distance between thriving urban life and buried ruin is a matter of decades, not centuries. And finally, it reminds us that the wind is not finished. It is still writing, still burying, still reshaping, still warning. If we fail to listen, future archaeologists may one day sift through the remnants of our own cities, wondering, as we wonder now, how people who believe themselves eternal could vanish so quietly beneath the sand.